Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we descend into the velvet-draped, meat-greased halls of Tudor England. Picture it. Flickering torchlight dances across gold-threaded tapestries, the scent of roasting venison hangs heavy in the air, and at the centre of it all is a young, athletic, dazzling prince. Yes, that Henry VIII. He's not the massive monarch you're probably imagining just yet. Oh no! At this moment he's svelte, strong, and genuinely easy on the eyes. He jousts like a hero from legend, composes music like a melancholy bard, and charms the nobility with courtly grace. The robe still fits snug, the armour gleams without strain, and the glances from ladies-in-waiting linger a little too long. But lean in close, because here's the twist. They probably won't survive this. Behind that glittering facade hides an appetite, insatiable, imperial, and fated to consume not only banquets, but bodies, marriages, and empires. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from somewhere across the globe, drop your city and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Henry's story doesn't begin in a turkey-stuffed throne room or strapped into a pulley-operated lift. It starts with promise. Born in 1491, he was the second son of Henry VII and not initially expected to wear the crown. His elder brother Arthur was meant to rule, and yet, with Arthur's untimely death in 1502, the heir's mantle dropped squarely onto young Henry's broadening shoulders. At just 17, he became king, and for the first few years England breathed a sigh of hope. He cut a striking figure, tall, muscular, with reddish-gold hair and a commanding stride. Contemporary accounts gush about his physical beauty, athletic prowess, and intellectual spark. He fenced, he danced, he could out-hawk most of his nobles and played a mean game of tennis, all while charming foreign ambassadors in half a dozen languages. He was in many ways the Renaissance ideal. Had he stopped aging around 1515, we might still remember him as the handsome prince of fairy tale lore. But Henry never did anything halfway. That included eating. From the beginning, meals at his court weren't just sustenance, they were theatre. A typical feast might include up to 14 courses, with roasted swans, peacocks, and boar's heads glazed and garnished to perfection. Food was spectacle, status, and strategy all in one. And Henry? He adored it. Even in his sprightly 20s, he was developing a habit, overindulging not just in food, but in everything. This indulgence didn't go unnoticed. In 1511, not long after his coronation, a visiting Venetian ambassador commented on the lavishness of his meals and the king's hearty appetite. But no one dared criticise. After all, he still sparred like a warrior and galloped like a knight. His metabolism was a match for his meals, for now. There's a peculiar Tudor myth that Henry invented the roast beef sandwich. That one's likely bunk, but it speaks volumes about his brand. In the court of public imagination, Henry's always held a turkey leg, mid-bite. But the transformation from a lean prince to a monument of monarchic excess didn't happen overnight. It was slow, indulgent, and deeply tragic. By the time he reached his mid-30s, the first cracks began to show. His waist, once the envy of the kingdom, thickened. His doublets needed extra padding, not for show but for structure. Tailors started altering patterns, armourers widened breastplates, and Henry, he doubled down. Still hunting, still jousting, still dancing, but with a bit more wheeze and a longer rest between rounds. The pressure of producing a male heir didn't help. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, and the widow of his late brother Arthur, bore him several children, only one of whom, Mary, survived infancy. This failure to produce a son weighed heavily on Henry, not just emotionally but politically. Monarchs of the era equated male heirs with divine favour and dynastic stability. A king without a son was a king whose house could crumble. That stress manifested in food, big meals, frequent snacks, nightcaps of spiced wine and sugared sweets. By the 1520s, Henry's court became known not just for its opulence, but for its expanding king. A growing group of servants attended to his needs, including taste testers, napkin holders, and, eventually, a man whose sole job was to help lift him in and out of the royal bathtub. But at this stage, let's be fair, he's still not the colossal caricature we often imagine. He's thick, certainly, maybe even stocky, but not immobile. He's still performing in tournaments, though with more show than skill now, still composing music, including a few ditties that survive to this day. Still, on occasion, charming. Of course, historians still argue whether his changing body altered his mind, or if it was the other way around. Did his frustrations about succession and loyalty drive him to eat and isolate? Or did the creeping limitations of his own flesh shape his rage and paranoia? There's no clean answer, but something is shifting. The younger courtiers notice. The wives certainly do. His second marriage, to Anne Boleyn, is stormy, passionate, and politically disastrous. By the time of her execution in 1536, Henry is heavier still, both in body and spirit, a man in mourning, not just for love, but for youth, for legacy, and perhaps even for the image he once saw in the mirror. There's a striking account from this period, written by a French diplomat, that describes Henry as a prince once most glorious, now shadowed. The quote doesn't just refer to politics, it reflects the physical reality of a man who is beginning to struggle, not just with ruling, but with rising from a chair without assistance. And yet still, he eats, not always with joy, sometimes in silence, sometimes alone. But the food continues, as do the elaborate feasts, now with added ceremony to mask his increasing immobility. Platters are brought closer, stools placed discreetly behind him. Dances are observed rather than performed. The golden youth of England becomes a spectator in his own pageants. It's around this time, late 1530s, that historians mark a critical shift. Henry's daily rituals become more constrained, his steps fewer, his limbs stiffer. He begins to require the help of attendants for dressing. Special walking sticks, wide-seated chairs, and stronger horses are introduced. And yet, his pride remains untouched. There's a portrait painted in 1537 by Hans Holbein the Younger that still hangs in the collective memory. The one where Henry stands, legs apart, fists on hips, eyes blazing. It's propaganda, of course. The real Henry likely couldn't strike that pose unaided. But the message was clear. The king is still here, still in charge, still powerful, even if his belt has added 3 new holes. The court whispers, "Of course, they always do, but no one speaks openly, not yet." The man is still feared, still the head of the Church of England, still a monarch who can summon the axe with a frown. But behind closed doors, as the nights grow longer and the joints ache louder, a quieter story unfolds. One of a man who once danced at midnight, now tucked into bed before sunset, who once climbed towers to hunt hawks, now wheeled between rooms on padded litters, and all the while the food keeps coming. By the early 1540s, Henry VIII's once proud silhouette has become unmistakably round. His chest still juts forward, but now it's padded with flesh rather than pride. His limbs are thick, not with muscle, but with mass. And his belly, his belly, moves a beat behind him, like a slow, regal wave. There's a sense of sadness about it all. A man once so alive, so fiercely kinetic, now wheezing at the top of the palace stairs. The shift isn't just physical. Henry's moods darken like English skies in late November. He's irritable, snappish, and prone to explosive outbursts. Courtiers learn to read his face like sailors watching the sea. A tight jaw means danger. A quiet sigh. You're safe, for now. And when the king's belt doesn't fasten, it's best not to be in the room. Armour becomes a visible battleground. His old jousting gear, once sleek and ornate, no longer fits. At first, tailors attempt modifications, letting out seams, adding new buckles, but there's only so much they can do before the entire piece starts to resemble a hammered kettle. By 1544, one of his suits of armour requires a chest circumference of over 50 inches, with the waist even wider. To give perspective, that's not a tunic, it's practically a man-sized safe. A court rumour makes the rounds. A blacksmith was nearly imprisoned for laughing while adjusting the king's codpiece. No one confirms it, but no one doubts it either. Of course, historians still debate whether Henry genuinely cared about his changing appearance, or if he saw it as part of his divine right. Some argue he leaned into the image of the great heavy king, unmovable and imposing like a castle tower. Others say his vanity persisted until the end, masked only by selective portraiture and sheer royal denial. Still, it's undeniable that his expanding body affects more than just fashion. His mobility becomes a matter of state. Stairs are now a personal enemy. Long walks are abandoned. Outdoor hunts become orchestrated spectacles, with game herded within shooting distance so the king can fire from a seated position. His beloved jousting, a memory, and a painful one at that. The tilt yard, once his personal arena of glory, now echoes with silence. The same place where Henry had once thundered on horseback, earning the admiration of foreign dignitaries and the longing gazes of courtiers, now serves mostly as a practice space for younger nobles. The king watches from a pavilion, wine cup in hand, layered in furs to protect him from the damp English chill. Some whisper that he misses it, others insist he barely notices. But the truth lies somewhere in the middle. A man who remembers what he once was, and a court too terrified to remind him. The armour tightens, the tempers flare. The tempers. His household staff adapts quickly. Chairs are widened, thrones are reinforced. Bathing routines, once a luxurious soak in perfumed water, now require lifts and assistance. Henry's weight has crept past 300 pounds, massive by 16th century standards. The stairs at Whitehall Palace are now less a challenge and more a hazard. At least once he reportedly slips and falls, unable to rise without help. Afterward, plans begin for something new, something mechanical. But that's for later. For now, we return to the banquets, because that's where much of his day still revolves. Each meal a performance, dishes arrive by the dozen, spiced capons, sweet custards, pies stuffed with pigeon or eel, all presented in lavish displays. Sugar, newly abundant thanks to trade, is used in everything. Sauces, garnishes, even sculpted into table centerpieces. One chronicler describes a dessert shaped like a castle, with tiny sugar soldiers and marzipan cannons. And Henry, he eats, not ravenously, but consistently, and with the entitlement of someone who's never had to stop. Food comforts, it entertains, it distracts. Doctors begin to worry, quietly. Gout returns with a vengeance, swelling his joints and turning each step into a stab of agony. His legs are wrapped in bandages soaked in herbs. Poultices are applied. Occasionally live plasters, mixtures of honey, bread, and even moss, are slapped onto his ulcers in the hope they'll draw out the rot. It's a grim, oozing business, one never spoken of during dinner. Yet even among the gloom, some find ways to flatter. One court physician boldly declares that the king's heaviness is a sign of divine favour, a body so blessed it retains earthly richness. Henry predictably rewards the man with a new stipend and a seat at future feasts. Still, there's no hiding the discomfort. Custom-made footstools now appear wherever he sits. Meals are shortened, though not by choice. Sometimes, in mid-feast, he must excuse himself, not from indigestion, but exhaustion. The mere act of eating tires him. But nothing enrages him more than betrayal by his own clothes. There's a moment recorded in a chamber servant's diary where Henry attempts to dress himself, only to find that none of his doublets fit. He flies into a rage, hurling a goblet across the room and demanding his tailor be summoned before sundown or lose his fingers. The tailor arrives, miraculously with a suitable garment. Crisis averted, fingers spared, but the mood lingers, and the court, it adapts, slowly, cautiously. Conversation shifts subtly. Compliments focus on his intellect, his wisdom, his divine authority. No one remarks on his gait or the need for 3 attendants to help him rise. Paintings continue to depict him as broad-shouldered and invincible. Holbein's masterpiece remains the reference point, even if it's now a fantasy. Among the nobility, a curious side effect emerges: imitation. A few courtiers, eager to curry favour, begin to adopt Henry's habits. They eat more, they recline, they build up their own girths in what some historians call political padding. A risky mimicry that signals loyalty but comes with health consequences. Of course, none can match Henry's scale, nor would they want to. By 1545 his legs are so swollen that standing for more than a few minutes leaves him winded. The skin around his calves cracks and weeps. His boots, once embroidered with gold thread, now need to be slit open each evening to avoid tearing flesh. It's around this time that he begins to take most of his audiences seated. Foreign envoys are instructed to bow deeper, speak louder, and never, under any circumstance, offer help if the king appears to struggle. Even sympathy in the Tudor court could be fatal. Yet, amid all this, he remains terrifyingly in control. Parliament still bends to his will. Nobles still quake at his nod. When he enters a room, even wheeled in on a litter, silence falls like snow. There is undeniably something majestic about him. Something vast, immovable, and relentless. And that's the contradiction at the heart of it all. A body failing, but a will undimmed. A monarch who cannot walk a flight of stairs, yet climbs political heights with brutal precision. A king whose armour no longer fits, but whose threats still land like iron. One court jester, foolishly bold, once quipped that Henry should replace his sword with a fork, he wasn't seen again. In private, Henry reportedly laughs at such jokes, at least on good days. On bad days, he throws things. By now, his physicians are rotating in shifts. Bloodletting becomes routine. Urine samples are examined like crystal balls. Each ache, each fever sparks a new regimen. He's fed boiled nettles, spiced wine, dried toad powder, and occasionally what's called the king's syrup, a mix of opium, honey, and crushed pearls. Its effects, calming and mildly delusional. But nothing stops the tide. He is swelling, not just in girth, but in myth. England has never seen a monarch like this, so powerful, so burdened, so corporeally present, and soon stairs will be only the beginning of his spatial challenges. The Tudor court rises each day to the scent of roasting meats and the sound of buckles tightening. Henry VIII, now firmly in his 50s, is no longer just a monarch. He's a gravitational force. Everything in Whitehall and beyond orbits his needs, his moods, and increasingly, his meals. There's something almost planetary about him now. Vast, unpredictable, capable of eclipsing all others with a single turn of the eye. The banquet halls, once arenas of revelry and performance, begin to resemble war zones of digestion. Whole teams of cooks, carvers, and kitchen boys bustle in the bowels of the palace, producing enough food daily to sustain a small village. Their output is legendary. One observer reports that at a single meal, Henry consumes portions of goose, lamb, venison pie, and custards rich with almond and rosewater, each dish more elaborate than the last. The king's table is a display of absurd opulence: swans with gilded beaks, pies that reveal live birds upon cutting, a trick lifted straight from nursery rhymes, dishes shaped into hunting scenes and miniature castles. His favourites: anything roasted, heavily spiced, and presented with theatrical flourish. Spice, in fact, is one of the most prized commodities of his table. Pepper, cloves, and cinnamon, expensive imports, are used with the reckless abandon only a monarch could afford. But what the court sees in spectacle, Henry feels in pain. He suffers quietly at first, then more vocally from chronic digestive issues. Ulcers in the legs have made walking near impossible. Gout flares so severely that his feet puff like loaves of unbaked bread. Even sitting too long causes aches, his bones resenting the weight they must carry. His physicians try everything. They draw blood from his arms and ankles, insisting it will balance the humours. They administer enemas with syringes carved from ivory and cow horn. Sometimes they prescribe long walks, which is met with a royal glare and the silent dismissal of the suggestion. Other times it's more exotic: powdered rhino horn, boiled comfrey root, even crushed emerald. Nothing truly helps. At night he tosses and turns on a reinforced bed, built with extra oak beams and a latticework of cords strong enough to support a winch. His snoring, reportedly thunderous, rattles tapestries on the wall. Servants stationed nearby must wake quickly if the king cries out in pain, often to soothe ulcers that have burst or reposition pillows to ease cramping joints. Despite the discomfort, the feasts continue. To Henry, food is not just pleasure, it's politics. Seating arrangements are calculated like battle formations. Who sits near the king today might find favour tomorrow. A gift of candied oranges or a particularly fine roast could earn a courtier a promotion. Conversely, missing a banquet without excuse. Suspicious, possibly treasonous. Eating beside Henry has become not only a privilege, but a performance of loyalty. And yet, increasingly, these feasts end with Henry clutching his gut, groaning softly. There's no medical term in Tudor England for eating oneself into oblivion, but if there were, it would be scribbled beside his name in the physician's ledger. His appetite doesn't decline, it merely becomes more complex. Soups must be cooled to a precise temperature. Meats must be salted just so. Bread must be white, fluffy, and warmed by a page's hand before being passed to the king. Gastronomic rituals turn to theatre. A servant is tasked with presenting each new dish with a bow and a short recital of its ingredients. Another fanatically tests the temperature of wine with his lips before serving. Still others stand by with napkins pre-folded into ornate shapes, just in case the king sneezes. But beneath the extravagance, there's a creeping sense of desperation. Henry's once powerful body is betraying him at every turn. His legs often give out without warning. He rarely walks unassisted. His groin, afflicted with a festering sore, emits an odour his staff pretends not to notice. Courtiers adopt a curious lean when near him, not out of deference, but to subtly angle their faces away from the scent. And yet no one speaks of decline. not out loud. To suggest the king is anything less than the apex of English might is to invite disaster. Even Anne of Cleves, his fourth wife, tactfully avoids commenting on his physical condition when their marriage is annulled. Historians still argue whether she found him repulsive or simply bewildering, but the truth likely lies somewhere in between. Their wedding night, reportedly devoid of consummation, passes with a whimper, not a bang. Henry later complains that he was too tired, that his bride was unappealing, and that he liked her not. A curious excuse, perhaps, from a man who needed assistance just getting into bed. This growing list of bodily complaints leads naturally to more experimentation. Physicians begin to keep special logs tracking his urination, his bowel movements, his moods in relation to the moon. His diet, once indulgent, is now a paradox, both tailored and outrageous. He's advised to consume more fruit, so he orders imported melons and figs, told to cut back on meat, so he adds more fish, often fried in lard. When recommended a broth-based meal, he demands that it be thickened with bread, cream and wine. Even the royal dogs begin to grow fat, fed scraps from Henry's own table. It becomes something of a joke among the lower servants, that no one in Whitehall, human or hound, dares turn down food in the king's presence. Then there are the bellyaches. These are no ordinary stomach cramps. They are thunderclaps in the gut. Each one sends a ripple through the court, meals paused, musicians silenced. Henry will grip the edge of the table, eyes shut, face red, while a physician rubs his back or fans his brow. Sometimes a servant offers a cloth, which he bites down on to muffle a groan. Other times he simply stands, if he can, and leaves without a word. The palace adjusts to these episodes. Secret hallways are kept clear. Medical supplies are stashed behind tapestries. A private lavatory, rarely spoken of, is built into the rear of the great chamber, an innovation for its time and an absolute necessity for its monarch. Still, none of this curbs his appetites. Not for food, not for power. Even as his health declines, Henry remains a force in politics. His decisions carry the weight of nations. He schemes, plots, negotiates and commands with the same fervour he once reserved for hunting. His mind, despite the pain, remains razor sharp, at least on most days. But there are rumours of bad days. Days when he forgets names, when he misplaces decrees, when he repeats commands or stares into space too long. These, of course, are not spoken of in public. But the whispers are there, faint as the creak of an overburdened floorboard. There's one particular banquet that becomes legend among his courtiers. Held to celebrate the betrothal of a distant cousin, it features an absurd 34 courses, including a roasted deer stuffed with live songbirds. Henry, dressed in a gown of blue velvet, eats heartily. He toasts, he laughs, and then, mid-toast, he collapses backward, not unconscious, just winded, trapped by the weight of his own body in a chair too narrow for comfort. 4 servants rush to lift him. The room freezes. Henry, face red as a cardinal's robe, curses loud enough to startle the harpsichordist into silence. Then, as he's propped upright, he laughs, a huge wheezing laugh that echoes through the chamber. "Too much joy," he bellows. The court joins in nervously, but after that night the chairs are widened again, quietly, without fanfare, and that in many ways becomes the pattern. Henry falls, and the palace rearranges itself to catch him. His gluttony is not just tolerated, it's ritualized, built into the very architecture of court life. Every ache, every sigh, every uncomfortable shift in the throne is met with a team ready to soothe, cover or distract. And still, the feasts continue. Because in Tudor England, a king must be seen, heard, and above all, fed. The palace grows quieter with each passing year, even as the meals grow louder. Trays clatter, goblets clink, and the hollow thud of Henry's cane echoes along stone corridors, polished smooth by the scurrying feet of those trying to stay one step ahead of the king's moods. But within the great halls, something fundamental is shifting. Not just Henry's bulk, but his perception of himself. Once he was the embodiment of chivalry, handsome, daring, gallant. Now he's a figure of contradiction, a man whose power grows even as his body betrays him. And at the core of his unravelling lies a tangled web of ambition, appetite and wounded pride, knotted in no small part around the issue of his wives. By now his marital saga has become as infamous as his expanding waistline. Catherine of Aragon is long gone, divorced and exiled. Anne Boleyn's head has met the block. Jane Seymour, perhaps his true love, died giving him the son he so desperately sought. Anne of Cleves was a brief, politically motivated misstep, an annulled union marked more by awkward glances than affection. And then came young Catherine Howard, whose beauty briefly reignites something resembling passion in the aging king, until her adultery sees her executed too. By the time he marries Catherine Parr, his sixth and final queen, Henry is less a husband than a sovereign who demands companionship, nursing, and, above all, obedience. And through it all his waistline grows, his knees ache, and his soul, some say, begins to curdle. It is in these later marriages that the full psychological toll of his declining health becomes most visible. There are evenings when he speaks fondly of Jane Seymour, wistfully comparing her quiet demeanour to the loud and reckless girls who followed. He strokes a small painted likeness of her, and on occasion falls silent for long stretches. Other nights he erupts in a fury, railing against imagined slights or questioning why God has plagued him with such disloyal wives and such fragile sons. Court physicians begin to notice the symptoms of what they call melancholia. Long periods of brooding, outbursts of rage followed by moments of tearful regret. The emotional seesaw mirrors his physical decline. He shuffles through the palace like a storm cloud, rumbling with mood, soaked in sweat, and always preceded by the thud of a walking stick and the rustle of silk sleeves struggling to keep up with his breadth. But what perhaps stings most deeply is the memory of who he once was. The palace walls still hold echoes of his youth, the rooms where he danced till sunrise, the courtyards where he played tennis under the gaze of noblewomen. These are no longer spaces he can enter freely. Narrow staircases, uneven flagstones, and low door frames have turned his kingdom into a trap of proportions. Servants now measure thresholds. Hallways are padded. And in the most humiliating twist of all, a royal litter, a chair carried by 4 strong men, is introduced for transport between wings of the palace. He doesn't use it often, not publicly at least, but it's there, always waiting. These accommodations, while necessary, do little to soothe his ego. For a man who once prided himself on his physical prowess, relying on others to lift, bathe, and even carry him is an insult too deep for words. So he channels his frustration elsewhere, on his wives, his ministers, his enemies, real or imagined. The Privy Council grows wary. Every decision is now made with twice the caution and half the confidence. Even long-standing advisers like Thomas Cranmer learn to speak in riddles and offer opinions only when directly asked. Because Henry is no longer just a king. He is a volcano, volatile and looming, always on the verge of eruption. One story, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps not, tells of a foreign diplomat who made a comment about Henry's health, suggesting that France's king appeared more sprightly. Henry reportedly laughed, drained his wine, and within the week the diplomat was recalled by his sovereign under mysterious circumstances. Yet for all the fury, there are also flashes of strange tenderness. With Catherine Parr, he finds something resembling peace. She's clever, educated, and, most crucially, patient. She reads to him at night, selects his clothes in the morning, and oversees his medications with the care of a seasoned nurse. Henry, for all his bombast, grows to respect her, perhaps even love her in his own distant, sovereign way. It's in these late-night readings that another facet of Henry emerges, the thinker, the theologian, the man who once wrote treatises against Martin Luther and later tore England from Rome's grasp. Between spoonfuls of stewed pears and sips of fortified wine, he discusses scripture, politics, and the nature of kingship. His mind, though clouded by pain and laced with paranoia, still sparks with brilliance. But such moments are fleeting. The body always intrudes. One evening during a private audience, Henry tries to rise from his chair unassisted. The attempt ends in a stumble, and he crashes hard against a table leg, toppling a bowl of quince jam across the tiled floor. The room freezes. A physician rushes forward. Henry waves him off. He attempts to joke. The ground just missed a royal embrace. No one laughs. That fall leaves a bruise on his thigh that doesn't heal properly. The wound opens into another ulcer, one that festers and weeps for months. Its stench, unmistakable and thick, permeates his chambers. Servants begin lighting bundles of herbs and scattering rose petals to mask the smell. When that fails, they simply hold scented cloths to their faces and breathe shallowly. And yet the king endures. He is not felled by falls or ulcers or the whispered mockery of foreign courts. He continues to rule, continues to marry, continues to dine. The medical treatments grow more desperate. An alchemist is summoned to concoct a spirit elixir meant to revive his energy. It smells of vinegar and pepper and nearly makes him retch. Another doctor suggests fasting. He's promptly banished. A third prescribes leeches. The sight of them wriggling in a silver bowl is enough to make the kitchen staff lose their appetite, but Henry allows the treatment, briefly. None of it works. What does bring some relief, oddly enough, is music. Henry, ever the Renaissance man, still composes simple melodies. He hums to himself in the bath, taps rhythms on the arms of his chair, and occasionally surprises courtiers by requesting a lute player after supper. One particularly melancholy tune, now lost to history, was said to have moved his listeners to tears, a rare glimpse of vulnerability from a king who built his empire on control. But music can only soothe so much. By the time he turns 55, Henry is more furniture than man, immense, immobile, but still central. His attendants no longer try to disguise his condition. The king eats, groans, commands, and signs decrees from a bed that creaks with the weight of his ambition and his regrets. His legs are wrapped in linen soaked in vinegar and myrrh. His meals are trimmed slightly, less meat, more broth, but still far too rich. He drinks deeply, sleeps fitfully, and wakes each morning to the sound of his own laboured breath. And through it all, the court endures. Because to live in Tudor England is to live in Henry's shadow, be it glorious or grotesque. Remember, this was once a man who danced through palace halls, who rode horses like wind, who seduced a continent with charm and force. Now he rules from cushions, snarls through pain, and watches his world shrink to the size of a bedroom. But even in that decline, he is still king, and he will not go quietly. It is a strange thing, watching a king unravel, especially one who once defined himself by movement. Henry VIII, the athletic wonder of his youth, now spends most days propped up in chairs so reinforced they groan under his weight. The palaces, which once echoed with the rhythmic clatter of his boots, are now padded for silence. His body, a prison of flesh and inflammation, restricts him like iron shackles never could. He is no longer the dancing prince, nor the tireless jouster. He's a sedentary storm, thunderous, unpredictable, and increasingly still. The transformation is not lost on those around him. Where once he led hunting parties and royal progressions through muddy English woods, now he sends his nobles out in his name. They return with wild game and stories he pretends to enjoy. He nods, smiles faintly, and asks them to recount the thrill again and again, like a man starving not for food, but for action. This is the point where his injury takes centre stage, the infamous jousting accident of 1536. It begins innocently enough, a tilt in Greenwich, a brisk January day. The king, armoured and proud, enters the arena to cheers, but the horse beneath him falters, or maybe Henry misjudges his mount. Accounts vary, as they often do in Tudor history. What is certain, the fall is catastrophic. His horse lands atop him. He's unconscious for 2 hours. Some believe he briefly died. That moment, where his life likely hung by a thread, becomes the invisible crack in his body's foundation. From then on, everything sags, swells and stiffens. The leg injury never properly heals. Infection sets in. Ulcers bloom like nightmarish flowers. He begins to favour the injured side, causing an imbalance that leads to further strain across hips and spine. His muscles weaken. His gait becomes a waddle. Historians still debate whether this was the point when Henry's personality shifted dramatically. Before, he was stern but charming. Afterwards, he becomes volatile, paranoid, and deeply suspicious. Friends are dismissed. Advisors fall from favour with a single misstep. The king begins to trust only those who say what he wants to hear, and even then, only briefly. Physical decline begets emotional deterioration. The two feed each other in a vicious loop. When the pain spikes, he snaps at servants. When they flinch, he rages louder. And yet, even in his foulest moods, he maintains a precise awareness of his image. He demands cleanliness, polish, and grandeur. His chambers must smell of lavender and cedar. His sheets are changed daily. Gold-threaded robes are laid out in case he wishes to dress for an audience, though increasingly he does not. It is around this time that his daily schedule becomes a fortress of rituals. He rises late. Servants assist him in the cumbersome process of dressing. Stockings rolled carefully up swollen legs, shirts padded for comfort, tunics loosened at the seams to allow for the belly that refuses to stop expanding. A wide leather belt, custom punched for new notches, is buckled with care. Always a physician stands nearby, watching for signs of strain or breathlessness. Breakfast is a quiet affair. A soft-boiled egg, sometimes a bowl of beef broth. But even these light meals sit heavily. He leans back after each bite, eyes closed, breathing slow. Every morning, His Majesty awakens to a body that has aged more than it should. Gone are the morning rides, the walkabouts, the surprise visits to court chambers. Now those come to him. Ministers arrive with reports and scrolls. Courtiers wait for a nod to approach. Foreign dignitaries kneel longer, speak louder, and keep their distance unless beckoned. There's a new protocol. Do not touch the king unless explicitly ordered. Even doctors must wait for permission to examine his wounds. One can imagine how the younger Henry would have mocked this version of himself, wrapped in furs, belly spilling over lap, shifting endlessly to ease the pressure on his aching thighs. But that young man is buried now, beneath layers of injury and indulgence. This is a king ruled by pain, by pride, and by memory. The palace, ever adaptable, begins to shape itself around his needs. Corridors are widened, steps are replaced with ramps, rooms on upper floors are abandoned in favour of ground-level chambers. A special platform is installed in the Great Hall, allowing Henry to be lifted, discreetly, hydraulically, onto his throne without struggling up the dire steps. It's all done in the name of majesty, of course. No one says the word handicap, but the truth is clear in the eyes of his most loyal servants. The king cannot move like he used to, and so the palace moves for him. His favourite dogs, once lively hunting hounds, now grow fat and sleepy in his presence. It's said they reflect their master. Henry finds this amusing. Good company, he calls them, as one snores on the velvet carpet at his feet. These animals are his constant companions, silent, uncritical, and unfazed by the stench of his leg wounds or the sudden shifts in mood. But humans are another matter. Marriages now serve less for passion than for companionship and political convenience. His relationship with Catherine Parr is grounded in mutual benefit. She provides care and loyalty, and he, in turn, offers stability and protection. But even she must tread lightly. A wrong word, a too bold opinion, and the ghost of Anne Boleyn stirs in the court's memory. Everyone remembers what happens to wives who push too hard. Despite his limitations, Henry still attempts the occasional illusion of normalcy. He insists on being seen at formal dinners. His arrival is orchestrated like theatre. Trumpets sound, doors open wide, a parade of attendants precedes him. Then, finally the king enters, either borne in a chair by servants or wheeled on a discreet cart depending on his mood. He is a spectacle, resplendent in velvet and jewels, rings on nearly every finger, a massive chain of office draped over his chest. From a distance he looks every bit the monarch. Only up close do you see the swelling in his ankles, the bandages hidden under embroidered cuffs, the way he leans slightly to one side, wincing if he sits too quickly. Still, no one dares pity him. That would be worse than mockery. During meals he presides with solemn grace, sampling dishes and offering critiques. He favours spiced lamb, stewed fruit, and strong wine. Despite doctors' warnings, his portions remain indulgent. He chews slowly now, methodically, as if each bite is a negotiation between hunger and pain. When finished, he signals with a nod, and the feast proceeds around him. On better days he converses, on worse ones he stares into space, lips moving in silent calculation. Occasionally he will mutter lines of scripture or half-remembered poems. The courtiers pretend not to notice. One moment, however, cuts through this twilight haze. A visiting French noble brings with him a book of music, new compositions from the continent. Henry listens as a chamber musician plays a piece written in 4 parts. It's complex, melodic, haunting. Something about the harmonies stirs him. He asks to hear it again, and again. Eventually he hums along, off-key but earnest. Later that night he calls for parchment and writes a few bars of melody himself. A slow tune, heavy with minor notes. He titles it simply Grace. Historians still argue whether this piece ever survived. Some say it was burned with his other papers after death. Others claim it was hidden among court archives. What's undeniable is the tenderness of the act. For a man so defined by control, it's a rare surrender to beauty. But the beauty fades quickly. Winter arrives harsh and early. Damp air seeps into the stone walls. Henry's ulcers worsen. His appetite shrinks slightly, but his need for comfort grows. He begins sleeping more during the day. He speaks less. His doctors suggest stronger remedies, opium, powdered pearls, infusions of herbs so rare they must be imported from Venice. The effects are mild. He remains trapped in his swollen frame, a monarch of meat and memories. Still he refuses to relinquish the throne. He continues to rule, to sign laws, to send letters. His hand trembles now when writing, but his signature is still bold. Henry R. Always Henry R. Because even in decline, even wrapped in layers of silk and soaked linen, he is still the king. and he will hold that title until his very last breath. The jousting accident of 1536, seemingly just one unfortunate event among many in Henry VIII's tempestuous reign, becomes the quiet fulcrum on which the rest of his life teeters. Though he recovers consciousness and manages to return to his duties, he never fully returns to the man he was. Something inside him is fractured, and it's not just bone. The injury opens a door to degeneration, and the rot walks right in. By the following year, those closest to him begin noticing a new Henry. His patience wears thin more quickly. His temper explodes with little provocation. He issues contradictory orders, then punishes those who follow the wrong version. Paranoia slinks into his decisions like a slow leak. Former allies suddenly fall from grace, replaced by younger, more flattering faces. The image of the gallant Renaissance monarch is fading fast, and in its place emerges something darker, more petulant, more dangerous. It's around this time that the physical consequences of his fall become undeniable. His left leg, injured in the crash, is now constantly bandaged. The ulcer, a foul sore that oozes pus and blood, never truly heals. Courtiers learn to stand upwind of him. Herbal poultices, honey salves, and even crushed insect applications are tried in rotation, but the stink remains. The infection likely never truly leaves his system. It seeps into his bloodstream, flares up in new places, and drains him of energy. What the royal doctors don't know, and couldn't know in their era, is that Henry is probably suffering from chronic osteomyelitis, a bone infection deep in his leg. This, combined with his already heavy frame and increasingly sedentary lifestyle, turns his lower limbs into near-useless trunks of agony. Walking, once second nature, now becomes a calculated risk. Stairs are eyed with suspicion. Even the shortest walk, say from bed to dining chair, requires effort, assistance, and a decent prayer. The accident doesn't just break his body, it breaks his rhythm. His daily schedule, once packed with audiences, hunts, rides, and court appearances, shrinks dramatically. Mornings stretch into afternoons with him still in bed. Servants grow used to the sight of their sovereign propped up on pillows, grimacing, dictating letters while a bowl of sugared plums rests at his side. His mood is dictated less by politics and more by swelling, physical and emotional. And yet, despite this downturn, Henry still clings to his former glories. He insists on wearing his old hunting gear, albeit heavily modified with stretchable seams and hidden laces. His tailors become master illusionists, crafting garments that maintain the illusion of regal sharpness while hiding the unfortunate truth beneath. One day, a servant, either bold or foolish, comments that the king's boots no longer reach the knee. Henry stares at him in silence for an uncomfortable moment, then mutters something about new fashions and demands they be sent away for proper trimming. The boots are never mentioned again. Court morale suffers in tandem. The king's moods dictate the mood of the realm. When he's pleasant, music fills the halls. When he's sour, entire wings of the palace fall silent. Some nobles request extended hunting trips just to escape the atmosphere. Others retreat into sycophancy, praising the king's wisdom, his strength, even his virility, all while trying not to look too long at the man labouring to shift in his throne. But not everyone can leave. His closest advisors and medical team remain tethered to his side, performing an endless, delicate dance of care and concealment. Their job is twofold: to keep the king alive and to make him believe he is well. This often means elaborate rituals. Painful treatments are renamed invigorations. Bloodletting is performed with ceremonial flair, as if it's an act of renewal. New medicines are introduced in decorative goblets, garnished with mint and honey to mask the bitterness. None of it works, and so the palace itself begins to transform into a kind of sick room. The walls of his private chamber are lined with tapestries not just for decoration, but for warmth. His blood circulation now so poor that he's constantly cold. Windows are kept shut. Fires burn around the clock. At times he wears furs indoors. One visitor describes the royal suite as oppressively warm and thick with the odour of spices and sweat. In the afternoons he receives ambassadors. But even these sessions, once lively and strategic, are now shorter, punctuated by long pauses and visible discomfort. He shifts in his chair, winces when he leans, and grows impatient if conversations drag. His temper, always quick to flare, now ignites with the smallest spark. One wrong word, one perceived slight, and entire treaties are at risk. This instability unnerves even the most seasoned diplomats. Letters from foreign courts begin to reflect concern. Some describe him as still mighty but changed. Others use words like erratic, declining, and even unwell, but few dare say such things openly. England still possesses formidable power, and Henry's fury, when stirred, can shift the tide of nations. Back at home, palace staff develop an internal shorthand for Henry's condition. Blue morning means pain. Red morning means anger. Gold morning means a rare stretch of good humour. Entire meals are planned based on these codes. Musicians rehearse specific pieces to match his mood. Some days it's all slow madrigals, other days bold brassy marches fill the halls meant to lift his spirits. Nothing, however, truly lifts him. Not for long. Food, the old pleasure, still plays a central role, but now it's more necessity than indulgence. He eats because it's what kings do, because to refuse food would signal weakness. The meals are still elaborate, but his consumption is more restrained. Still, the dishes keep coming. Cooks, afraid of displeasing him, continue preparing vast spreads. Anything untouched is quietly consumed by the staff or given to the dogs. Those dogs, once lean and eager companions, now mirror their master. Fat, slow, loyal. They lounge near the hearth, occasionally nudging his hand for scraps. On good days, Henry chuckles and obliges. On bad days, he ignores them entirely. One particularly foul evening, after a painful attempt to walk unaided from bed to chair, he lashes out, not with fists, but with venom. He blames his doctors, accuses his servants of sabotage, and demands to see his old armour. When it's brought, still polished, still gleaming, he demands it be put on. The servants hesitate. Then, tentatively, they try. The breastplate cannot be closed, the greaves don't reach. The chainmail, once snug around his arms, cuts into flesh. Henry stares into the mirror for a long time, says nothing. Then, with a wave of his hand, he dismisses them all. That night he doesn't eat. The next morning he demands a new suit of armour be commissioned, one that fits, one that reminds the court and himself that he is still England's lion. It is never made. In public the fiction continues. Artists are instructed to paint him standing tall, arms akimbo, jaw firm, legs wide. The portraits become armour in themselves, visual lies that protect the reality from scrutiny. In one, he appears a giant, towering over all others. His face is calm, his doublet flawless. No hint of pain, no sign of decline. And yet, in private, he lies awake at night, leg propped, breath wheezing, staring at the canopy of his bed. He does not sleep much. When he does, the dreams are strange, fragments of youth, visions of tournaments, echoes of music long forgotten. Once, he wakes mumbling Jane's name. Another time, he calls for his mother. Servants, trained in silence, pretend not to hear. By the mid-1540s, the king who once rode at the head of glittering processions through the green hills of England now rarely leaves the confines of his palace. Henry VIII, once a vision of Renaissance vigour, has become something else entirely, an emperor of flesh, ruling not with movement or might, but from a cushion throne, his power somehow amplified by stillness. It is in this prolonged paralysis that a new form of Tudor mythology begins to take root, the story of gluttony elevated to grandeur. Historians would later call this the era of Tudor excess, and while royal banquets and silk-lined chambers had long been part of English court life, Henry's reign takes the spectacle to a new, almost surreal level. His personal habits become the very symbol of indulgence. It's not just that he eats too much, he lives too much. Every action, every moment is performed with imperial magnitude. The court grows accustomed to the strange logistics of serving a king who cannot stand for more than a few minutes. His meals are delivered on carts carved from oak and gold, wheeled in by men who have been trained not to make eye contact unless spoken to. Silver domes are lifted in synchronized rhythm, revealing courses arranged like still-life paintings, roasted herons with honey glaze, capons stuffed with almonds and raisins, platters of eel wrapped in pastry and glistening towers of jellied fruit. The king samples each with deliberation. His palate, oddly enough, has become more refined even as his appetite deepens. He no longer devours, he curates. One bite, a long pause, a thoughtful nod. Sometimes he speaks, too dry, too cold. This sauce lacks bravery. And with a flick of a bejewelled finger, the dish is dismissed, and another offered in its place. But even as he dines with grace, his body rebels. He eats slowly, yes, but after every course, a servant steps forward with a damp cloth to dab at his brow. His face flushes easily. Breathing grows laboured after the second plate. The bandages on his leg, hidden beneath the voluminous folds of his robes, require changing twice daily, sometimes more. Behind closed doors, the rituals become more clinical. His physicians are now surgeons in all but name. They lance, scrape, drain and bind. They create elaborate poultices from moss, crushed pearls and cow bile, applying them in shifts. They monitor the king's urine in little glass flasks, holding it to candlelight and whispering in anxious tones. One even insists on tasting a drop to judge its heat of spirit. That particular man does not return the next week. The king's apartments smell of clove oil, vinegar and old blood. The air is heavy with dampness and decay. Courtiers passing near the door bow quickly and move on. Servants cover their faces with perfumed rags. And still, inside, Henry reigns, barking orders, dictating proclamations, scrawling angry notes in his firm, sharp hand. And he is angry, increasingly so, because this is no longer just indulgence. It is erosion. The man who once saw the world as a chessboard now finds his pieces shrinking. His influence remains vast, but his ability to wield it, to pace, to confront, to inspire with a glance or a touch, dwindles. Where once he loomed in doorways like a god-king, now he must be announced with enough time for the room to prepare. Space cleared, air refreshed, chairs reinforced. Still, Henry refuses to yield entirely to helplessness. He weaponizes his appetites. If he cannot dazzle with physique, he will dominate with spectacle. Each feast is a demonstration of power. The more food presented, the more loyalty confirmed. Guests are expected to marvel, to partake, to groan in fullness. To decline a dish in the king's presence is to invite suspicion. Does it offend you, he might ask, or is it the cook you distrust? So the court eats, and eats. Nobles gain weight trying to keep up. Some suffer from gout themselves. One ambassador reportedly collapses after his 5th course and has to be discreetly removed. Henry laughs heartily, declaring, "England builds strong stomachs, if not strong alliances." But amid the laughter and clinking goblets, there are quieter, stranger developments. The architecture of the palace begins to change. Doorways are widened, not officially of course, but subtly. Furniture is replaced with broader versions. His private chamber gains a second bed, not for sleeping, but for eating, with a built-in tray that can hold half a dozen dishes at once. Even the privy chamber, previously a modest corner of royal hygiene, is expanded and redressed. Now it's fitted with rails, curtains and padded seats. A discreet water system is installed. No one calls it a throne, but the comparison is hard to avoid. Henry, ever sensitive to ridicule, develops an uncanny sense for when he's being judged. One afternoon he catches a young page smirking during a meal. The boy is dismissed that very night, his name never spoken again. Another servant is overheard describing the king's leg wound as a pit of sorrow. That servant is reassigned to Calais. The message is clear. Pity is not welcome. The king is not to be mourned. He is to be revered, even as he decays in real time. Yet beneath the layers of silk and bravado there are moments, fleeting, unguarded, when Henry lets something softer show. One winter evening, snow falling beyond the frosted panes, he calls for music. Not the brassy celebratory kind, but a quiet melody, something sombre. A lute is brought. The player, trembling slightly, begins a slow tune in a minor key. Henry listens with eyes closed, his breathing shallow but steady. After a while, he speaks. "Play it again. I heard Jane in that one." No one moves. The player, unsure, repeats the piece. Henry does not open his eyes again for the rest of the performance. Jane Seymour's memory lingers like the scent of old perfume. Of all his wives, she remains the one least tarnished in his mind. Perhaps because she gave him a son, Edward. Perhaps because she died before she could disappoint him. Whatever the reason, he speaks of her with reverence, never with the irritation he reserves for the others. And as his body grows more burdensome, her image becomes his refuge. Her name slips into conversation when he's tired. Sometimes he has her portrait brought into the dining chamber, propped against a chair so he can see her as he eats. Catherine Parr, ever pragmatic, allows this without protest. She understands. She has taken on the role of caretaker. You said, continue, full 2,000 to 2,100 words, no conversation, no search. ChatGPT said, Section 7, continued, not competitor, not muse, but the final port in a storm of broken unions. Catherine Parr reads to him from scripture, soothes him when fever strikes, and manages the palace with the patience of a seasoned nurse. She does not ask too many questions when Henry stares long at Jane's portrait. She does not interfere when he speaks to it under his breath. There is a quiet wisdom in her presence. an understanding that this king, bloated and brittle, no longer needs passion. He needs peace, and yet peace is not a Tudor luxury. Politics still churn, and Henry, immobile or not, keeps a hand in the game. He signs documents with a flourish, interrogates ministers from his chair, and occasionally throws a goblet when displeased. His temper, like his appetite, has only intensified. If he cannot move swiftly, he compensates by acting with sharp, decisive cruelty. Even now, nobles tremble when summoned. His body may sag, but his authority remains as tight as a noose. Still, there is a growing sense in the court that the king is on borrowed time. Whispers spread, softly, cautiously, that he no longer controls everything, that the crown weighs heavier with each passing month, that England, for all its showy strength, is preparing for a world without him. He, of course, denies it. Plans spring forth for more construction, more banquets, more treaties. He dictates ideas for a new royal procession, though it's clear to everyone that he could never survive the journey. A new suit of armour is commissioned again, though never finished. His tailors take his measurements, scribble down numbers with worried brows, and quietly set the sketches aside. The scale is no longer used. No one dares record the exact number, though estimates place him at well over £350 by this time. His leg wound, now a crater of rot, is packed daily with linen soaked in oils and herbs. When the pain grows unbearable, he takes to laudanum, a poppy-derived tincture that blurs the edges of reality. On those days he drifts in and out of sleep murmuring to himself, names from long ago, songs half remembered, orders that no longer make sense. And yet, amidst the ruin, there still flickers of the old Henry. One spring morning, uncharacteristically clear and warm, he demands to be wheeled to the gardens. The attendants, stunned, prepare the royal chair and arrange the route with military precision. Flowers are hastily replanted to appear more vibrant. Musicians are stationed under awnings. Servants line the path, bowing as he passes. When Henry emerges dressed in a brocade robe stretched taut over his vast frame, a hush falls. He looks ancient, regal, and strangely out of place in the sun, but he smiles just a little. He breathes deeply, as if trying to trap the scent of spring in his lungs. Birds chirp overhead. A lute plays softly. For a brief moment, he is not the suffering monarch, not the swollen figure of ridicule. He is simply a man carried on a velvet chair taking in the world he has shaped. Later he tells Catherine, "I remember when I could walk these paths myself." She does not answer. She only takes his hand. That day becomes legend. The king's last outing, some call it. Afterward his health declines with shocking speed. He sleeps more than he wakes. His meals grow smaller. The leg wound deepens. New sores appear on his back and arms. His body, once so determined to expand, begins to betray him even faster. But he clings to ceremony. The rituals must not stop. The great clock chimes must be on time. Meals must be announced, even if untouched. His signet ring must be ready at all times, even if his fingers swell too thick to wear it. And always, always, he must be addressed as Your Majesty. The younger courtiers, many of whom had never seen him ride, begin to regard him less as a man and more as a symbol. They speak of him with reverence but little warmth. The older ones, those who had watched him dance, sing, fight and charm, carry their memories like medals. They remember the man beneath the monarch, the restless energy, the loud laugh, the fierce magnetic joy. But they too begin to fade from the court, retiring to country estates or vanishing into quiet obscurity. Henry remains, immense, immobile, enduring. He takes to dictating long letters late into the night, as if trying to outpace death with ink. To ambassadors, to bishops, to Edward's tutors, he gives instructions for his son's future, layering each with the weight of legacy. Teach him strength, but not cruelty, wisdom, but not doubt. And yet, there is doubt, of everything. He orders prayers for his soul while still alive, commissions music for his funeral, insists that his tomb be even grander than those of his predecessors. "No one shall forget me," he says once. Not a boast, a warning. By now his body is a battlefield. The ulcers fester. Gangrene creeps up his leg. Every movement risks rupture. A quiet panic begins to settle among the physicians, an understanding that nothing more can be done. Even the king's lungs begin to weaken, filling with fluid. He coughs for hours, retching into silken cloths, refusing to let anyone see the worst of it. And then one day he stops issuing commands. He falls silent, for the first time in memory. No proclamations, no complaints, just quiet. The court, unmoored, drifts cautiously around him. Ministers speak in whispers. The halls grow dim. Every creak of the floorboards is met with held breath. The king sleeps more than he wakes. When he does wake, he sometimes thinks he's elsewhere, at Hampton Court perhaps, or the fields at Greenwich. He talks to ghosts. He weeps once, quietly, without explanation. And then he begins to refuse food. No royal meal, no sugared plums, no wine, nothing. Catherine begs him. The doctors plead, servants bring broth in gold-rimmed bowls. He waves them all away. "I have eaten enough," he whispers, and he has. By the final years of Henry VIII's reign, his body has become an institution unto itself, carefully monitored, rigorously maintained, and entirely dependent on the constant labour of others. Every day, dozens of servants manage the ecosystem of his physical presence, and none more visibly than in the management of his most sacred spaces, his thrones and his beds. The royal thrones, once symbols of power and posture, now have to be custom-built to accommodate a king who can no longer support his own weight. Gone are the elegant, narrow-backed chairs of his youth, those days when he sat high and upright, sword at his side, radiating command. In their place are wider, deeper seats with reinforced legs, thickly padded arms, and occasionally a discreet pulley system under the cushions to help ease him upright. These are thrones less fit for ruling, and more reminiscent of well-dressed medical recliners. The craftsmen responsible for these modifications operate under strict secrecy. No one is to speak of the structural changes, the extra reinforcements, the hidden hinges, the widened girths. These pieces are not designed for style, but for survival, crafted with the same reverence as a crown, and nearly as much political consequence. A throne too narrow could humiliate the king. A chair that creaks under his weight might inspire treason. Henry knows this, and he demands only the finest. "Let it bear me as a stallion bears its rider," he once said, gesturing at a new seat with lion-clawed legs and a scarlet velvet cushion the size of a mattress. The throne, displayed in the great hall at Hampton Court, became a subtle warning to those who entered. Here sits a king too large to be lifted, too powerful to be moved. But the thrones are only part of the story. His beds, more intimate, bear even more elaborate reinvention. The royal bedchambers evolve into private fortresses, both for rest and for control. One particular bed, built at Whitehall Palace, reportedly measures over 7 feet wide and nearly the same in length. Its frame is constructed from the hardest English oak, carved with scenes from the Old Testament. Judges and warriors, men of size and stature. Some of the carvings are padded behind the headboard, where the king might lean as he listens to his court read aloud or dictates to his secretaries. The mattress, triple stuffed with down, is lined with layers of silk and wool to absorb the night sweats that plague him. Underneath the bed is a mechanism, equal parts pulley and lever system, designed to adjust the angle of the bed with minimal effort. At a single pull of a tasseled cord, the king can be tilted forward to a sitting position or reclined to rest. It is quite literally a throne in repose. The bedding must be changed daily, often multiple times. Ulcers weep through the sheets. Fevers drench them in sweat. No matter how fine the linen, it does not last. Entire storerooms at Hampton Court are dedicated to royal bedding, scented, folded and rotated like military supplies. Some are perfumed with lavender, others soaked briefly in rosewater. One particularly favoured set is embroidered with the Tudor rose and stitched with gold thread, a reminder that even in decline, Henry demands regality. Every morning the King's Rising becomes a production. First, 2 footmen enter to open the curtains, softly in case he still sleeps. Then the physicians quietly conferring as they inspect the bandages from the night before. The king is examined, wiped down, and gently rolled with the help of attendants. His body, stiff and aching, resists every movement. Servants speak only when necessary. Then comes the changing of the bed linens, a process that involves no fewer than 6 attendants. One lifts the leg, another applies fresh poultices, a third arranges the pillows just so. The rest, with practiced speed, strip and replace the bedding with fresh layers, ensuring the king is never exposed too long to cold air. Next, the robing. Gowns must be selected based on weight, flexibility, and accessibility. Some robes now open from the back, allowing them to be draped over his shoulders without lifting his arms. Buttons are replaced with hidden hooks, belts become sashes, everything is made larger, more accommodating, and everything must look intentional. The court is not to know the extent of the alterations. Appearances are to be preserved, At all costs. Even if the king cannot walk from one room to another without gasping, he must look like he could summon armies with a whisper. To assist with this illusion, artists remain in quiet demand. Portraiture, once a celebration of youth and glory, becomes a shield. Every new image of Henry shows him upright, wide-shouldered, firm of jaw, legs apart like a conqueror. Painters are instructed to use templates from earlier works. Subtle changes in his face are permitted, more grey in the beard, a slightly deeper frown. But nothing of the swelling, the sores, or the bloated midsection must appear. Holbein's iconic portrait, the one in which Henry looms, hands on hips, eyes unblinking, becomes the standard. A lie? Yes, but a necessary one. For the court, for the people, for the man himself. Meanwhile, within his private spaces, engineers and craftsmen continue to build around him. Stairs are replaced by ramps, floors are polished smooth to allow for wheel carriage access. A special hoist is installed above the bed, rigged with ropes and pulleys so he can be lifted carefully when the ulcers flare too severely to permit rolling. The hoist is covered with silk drapes and gold tassels. To visitors, it looks like an elaborate bed canopy. Only the servants know its true function. Some rooms are redesigned entirely to eliminate narrow doorways. Others are abandoned when the king can no longer access them. Whole wings of the palace are reduced to storage space simply because Henry's world has narrowed. His sphere of movement is now a carefully managed radius. Bedchamber, privy, dining chamber, audience room. No more gardens, no more great halls. The king has become a sovereign of corridors and cushion-padded chairs. It is in this constricted kingdom that new forms of ceremony emerge. The royal rest, as it's euphemistically called, becomes a formal occasion. Guests are invited not to walk with the king, but to sit in his presence. Meals are shortened to match his fatigue. Discussions are more focused. Speeches are shorter. Audiences are brief. And every movement, every cough, every sigh is noted by the ever-watchful eyes of courtiers desperate to interpret the state of the realm through the state of the body. Henry is acutely aware of this. It both flatters and infuriates him. On days when he feels stronger, he scolds his ministers for their timidity, demanding longer counsels, more detail, greater fervour. On weaker days, he waves them away, insisting he needs rest, not reports. This unpredictability becomes its own power. No one knows which king they'll face, the lion or the invalid. Catherine Parr, wise and perceptive, adjusts better than most. She ensures the king's spaces are always prepared, never too hot, never too cold. She limits the number of guests admitted per day. She curates his reading material. She sends word in advance to his physicians, suggesting gentler treatments on days he seems more irritable. She also manages the invisible emotional scaffolding that holds him up. When he despairs, she encourages. When he rages, she absorbs. She's not just queen, but guardian. And though there is no tenderness in the romantic sense, none that survives the leg ulcers and constant pain, there is a kind of quiet love. The love one has for a storm that will not pass but must be endured. At night, when the palace dims and the corridors empty, Henry rests in his great bed, swaddled in layers of velvet and linen. Outside, the Thames murmurs, the wind rattles shutters, and the world goes on. Inside, the king stares at the ceiling, where a painted canopy of stars and cherubs watches him back. He blinks slowly, lips moving in silent prayer, or perhaps not prayer at all, but memory. Because in these final years, every moment in that bed is a strange tangle of present and past. He remembers Jane, the jousts, the music, the feasts that once thrilled him, and now barely tempt. He remembers what it meant to walk into a room and feel it bend to his presence, not out of fear, but out of awe. Now the rooms bend only to accommodate his bulk. The glory, like the waistline, has become too heavy to carry, and yet he does carry it. With a kind of terrible majesty, Henry VIII, bedridden, breathless, bloated, still holds England in his grasp. In the waning days of Henry VIII's reign, one of the most constant sources of royal frustration is not the ache in his joints or the bitterness of his medicines, it is the unending war with his own wardrobe. Clothing, once a source of pride and flamboyant expression, has now become a daily trial of patience, engineering, and creative tailoring. The royal wardrobe, like the king himself, is under siege. In his younger years, Henry had been a fashion icon. He set trends across Europe. His doublets sparkled with gems. His cloaks were edged with ermine. He wore hose so tight they revealed calves that became the envy of every court in Christendom. His codpieces alone could fill an entire chapter of Tudor theatrics. often absurdly exaggerated, adorned with lace, jewels, and the occasional tassel. But now those days are long behind him, and his clothes have had to evolve in desperation just to keep up with the relentless expansion of his body. By the 1540s, dressing the king has become a logistical operation requiring a small team. The Royal Wardrobe Office, already one of the largest departments in the palace, is now consumed almost entirely with one task: keeping the king clothed in garments that preserve the illusion of majesty while conceding to his growing immobility. Every garment must be custom-fitted, adjustable, and flexible, and yet must give no outward indication of these accommodations. In essence, Henry's tailors are forced to become masters of illusion. Each new doublet is carefully crafted with reinforced seams, wide gussets beneath the arms, and hidden panels that can be let out as needed. Buttons are replaced with cleverly concealed hooks and ties. Many of his robes are now open-backed, allowing them to be draped over him rather than slipped on. His arms too stiff, his torso too broad for anything resembling traditional dressing. Tudor fashion, already elaborate, reaches new levels of complexity. Some of the king's garments now weigh over 20 pounds, not because of ornamentation, but because of layers upon layers of fabric added for structure and strength. They must support, not just drape. They must shape without squeezing. It is not uncommon for a newly finished doublet to be obsolete within months, his size having outpaced the tailor's best efforts. A running joke among his inner circle, not voiced aloud of course, is that the tailors measure him weekly, more often than the physicians take his pulse. The royal wardrobe is updated constantly with freshly cut cloth, imported from Italy, Spain and Flanders. New silks are dyed in deeper tones to mask perspiration. Sashes are made extra wide to cinch the expanding waist, though never too tightly, lest they press against his sensitive stomach. Even his undergarments, linen shifts and hose, are custom woven with panels of looser weave, so they stretch gently instead of constricting. Behind the scenes, whole rooms in Hampton Court and Whitehall Palace are dedicated to housing his clothes. Not shelves or simple closets, but vast galleries of garment racks, organised not by style or season, but by feasibility. Some are labelled formal audience seated only. Others, dining tunic, no assistance required. One set is simply marked emergency options, loose-fitting robes of forgiving wool, to be worn when all else fails. And while these modifications allow the king to function, if only barely, they cannot conceal the truth from those who must dress him. His valet, the unfortunate soul who bears the daily task of draping fabric over the royal personage, becomes both tailor and confidant. The king barks and scolds, yes, but sometimes he sighs, long, wheezing sighs that seem to come from a place deeper than flesh. "Another inch," he mutters once, eyes half-lidded as a belt is fastened with visible strain. "God help me, another inch and I'll need a sail, not a sash." The valet says nothing, of course, just tightens the belt one notch looser. Henry's outer garments may be flexible and generous, but his shoes become a nightmare of their own. His feet, swollen from gout and poor circulation, no longer fit into the ornate leather slippers he once paraded through court in. Instead, wide-toed, soft-soled house shoes are designed with extra padding and open laces. Most days he wears them indoors only, rarely venturing beyond his rooms. Boots are out of the question. He hasn't worn a proper riding boot in years. The king's discomfort with his changing appearance manifests in other ways too. He avoids mirrors now, except the large ceremonial one in his chamber, which reflects only the upper half of his body. Portraits are altered to match his old proportions. An artist who dares to paint him too accurately is quietly dismissed. Others are instructed to accentuate dignity, which is court speak for shave off 40 pounds with your brush. The psychological toll of these daily humiliations is not lost on Henry. His self-image, once so intertwined with his physicality, now cracks like the seams of his old doublets. He grows more irritable with each failed garment, more suspicious of those who offer compliments. Flattery is no longer balm, it is insult wrapped in honey. Yet his pride will not allow surrender. When a visiting envoy from Spain remarks politely on the richness of the king's robes, Henry responds not with thanks but with a glare. "I wear what suits my station," he says, "not what flatters the eye." But flatter they must. The entire court revolves around this fiction, that Henry VIII, though aged and ailing, remains the image of power. Every time he appears in public, no matter how rarely, his wardrobe must convey authority. No slack robes, no drooping sleeves, only grandeur. One such public appearance, a brief procession during the Feast of the Epiphany, is engineered with near military precision. The king is rolled into the chapel in a modified litter draped in cloth of gold. His robes, you said, continue, full 2,000 to 2,100 words, no conversation, no search. ChatGPT said, Section 9, continued, an opulent cascade of crimson and ermine are arranged so that the folds disguise the way he sits instead of stands. From a distance he appears regal, even awe-inspiring. The choir sings, the courtiers bow. Only those nearest can see the trembling of his hand beneath the sleeve, the beads of sweat that dot his temple, or the glint of anxiety in his eyes. He's swaddled in splendour, imprisoned by silk. The procession lasts under 10 minutes. By the time it ends, he is gasping softly, nearly slumping sideways in his seat. But no one speaks of it. The silence around his fragility is not just etiquette, it is survival. One wrong word, one careless observation, and you may find yourself reassigned to a distant corner of the realm, or worse, removed entirely from court life. After the service, the garments are removed piece by piece in the privacy of his chamber, like the peeling of a great velvet onion. His body, pale and marked with red lines from where the seams press too tight, is cleaned and rebandaged. The king says little during these routines. He closes his eyes, as though willing his mind elsewhere, back to tournaments, back to spring rides through the forests of Greenwich. But the nostalgia is fleeting. Pain brings him back quickly. In a desperate attempt to alleviate some of his suffering, his physicians recommend lighter fabrics, linens instead of wool, silks instead of brocades. Henry initially scoffs. What king wears linen like a monk, he demands. But after a particularly uncomfortable banquet where his robes chafe his ulcerated legs raw, he relents. Light tunics begin to appear beneath his robes, and a cooling system consisting of servants fanning scented air through hidden wall openings is implemented during summer months. Of course, this only increases the need for more garments. Each season now demands not only a new style, but a different function. Winter cloaks must be thick enough to keep his circulation from slowing, but light enough to avoid smothering him. Summer robes must be grand yet breathable. In a matter of months, the royal wardrobe expands to levels never seen before in English history. There are now more outfits designed for the king's comfort than for court ceremony. Tailors are summoned at all hours. Bolts of fabric arrive from Venice, Flanders, the Levant. New patterns are sketched on parchment. At one point, Henry demands an entire set of garments, dyed the colour of midnight blood, a deep purplish red that he insists flatters his complexion. The dye is expensive and the production ruins several looms before the desired shade is achieved. Still, he wears it once, just once, before declaring it too funereal. Then comes the greatest indignity of all, the growing impossibility of trousers. Tudor men wore hose, essentially tight-fitting leggings that connected to the doublet at the waist. In Henry's prime, his hose had been legendary, tailored to accentuate his muscular calves and regal stride. Now, they are the enemy. His legs swell daily, and the process of fitting hose becomes a painful ordeal. They cut off circulation, pinch the sores, and slip beneath the rolls of his thighs. After too many failed attempts, his tailors devise a workaround. Custom-fitted breeches with side slits, tied loosely with ribbons hidden beneath the tunic. They resemble trousers in name only. They're more garment than fashion, a compromise between reality and illusion. Yet even in this, Henry remains obsessed with control. He insists on approving every fabric choice, every clasp, every fold. He demands to see sketches. Samples are brought to him and placed on swatches of velvet. He runs his fingers over them slowly, sometimes absent-mindedly, as if remembering the days when dressing had been an act of conquest rather than survival. And so the wardrobe becomes a mirror, one that reflects not just his size but the scale of his delusion and determination. Every garment tells a story of compromise, between health and vanity, between mobility and majesty. It is the armour of a king who can no longer don armour. The courtiers play along. When summoned to dine, they arrive in their finest, hoping their own elegance will distract from the king's stiffness. Compliments are exchanged like currency. The cut of your majesty's sleeve is inspired. No monarch in Europe wears velvet with such authority. Truly, the embroidery sings, Henry nods, sometimes smiles. But his eyes remain distant. He knows. Of course, he knows. Behind the walls of the wardrobe rooms, the staff begin naming the more difficult garments after battles. Agincourt is a particularly stubborn doublet. Bosworth is the linen shift that takes 3 men to remove. Flodden is the robe so large it has to be stored in its own chest. And still, the sewing continues. Even the nightwear grows elaborate. silk sleeping robes lined with fleece, woolen caps embroidered with the Tudor rose, slippers so soft they're made of felted rabbit fur, a nighttime dressing gown with sleeves wide enough to pass a small dog through. He wears them not just for warmth, but for comfort. A fabric cocoon to shield him from the cold, both physical and political, that encroaches on all sides. One day, as he sits in his great chair, clad in a robe dyed deep sapphire, Catherine Parr leans in and whispers, "You still cut the figure of a king." He turns slowly. A round figure, perhaps. She smiles just a little. The shape of power changes, but the weight of it, that remains. He doesn't respond, but later, when the servants remove his robe, they find he's kept a small patch of the sapphire fabric gripped tightly in his fist. These final years see the wardrobe transformed into a gallery of grandeur and grief. Every garment is a contradiction, beautiful and functional, majestic and constricting, regal and ridiculous. They preserve the image of a monarch whose body has long since outgrown the throne it was built for. And yet, day after day, Henry VIII is dressed anew, layer upon layer, strap by strap, thread by trembling thread, until what rises from the bed is no longer a man but a monument, wrapped in silk, crowned in discomfort and stitched together with memory. There comes a moment in every monarch's life when physical decline becomes more than a personal trial. It becomes a national concern. For Henry VIII, that moment arrives the day he no longer climbs stairs. In the grand Tudor palaces, staircases are architectural centerpieces, curving, majestic, designed to carry power upward into chambers of velvet and candlelight. Henry had once ascended them two at a time, cloaked in fur, broad-shouldered and vibrant, footsteps echoing like royal thunder. But now they are impassable barriers, steep as cliffs and cruel as fate. He does not attempt them anymore, not out of caution, but necessity. His legs, ravaged by ulcers and racked by gout, will not carry him. His knees scream at each attempt. His breath grows short before he even reaches the first landing. To stand is effort. To climb is unthinkable. And so, the problem falls to his engineers. Thus begins the construction of one of the most curious devices in the annals of royal history. Henry VIII's personal stairlift. Not an electric contraption. Electricity won't arrive in palaces for centuries, but a mechanical hoist, designed with ropes, pulleys and counterweights, disguised in woodwork and gilded trim so as not to offend the majesty of the palace. The plan is simple in concept but elaborate in execution. At Whitehall Palace, the grand staircase leading from the lower audience chamber to his private apartments must be adapted. A chair, wide and deeply cushioned, is mounted on a wooden platform attached to a sturdy rope and pulley system. The platform can be raised and lowered by a team of men operating cranks from the stairwell above, hidden behind a partition of carved lattice. When not in use, the entire mechanism is concealed beneath a tapestry, but when summoned, the servants spring into action. The chair is rolled to the base of the stairs. The king is helped into place with the careful coordination of 3 or 4 strong attendants. Once settled, he nods, often with a look of strained tolerance, and the platform begins to rise. It creaks, it groans, it rises slowly, but it works. The invention is heralded in private as a miracle of Tudor ingenuity. In public, it is never mentioned. To speak of it aloud would be to admit that the king cannot walk to his own bed. To note its presence is to risk punishment. And so, among the palace staff, it is simply called the lift, spoken with capital letters and reverent tone. Henry pretends not to notice the stairs when he uses it, but he does. He feels the difference between the days when he mounted a horse with ease and these new days when he is hauled upstairs like a sack of royal grain. His pride, ever sharp, absorbs the insult quietly, then bleeds it into new outbursts of rage elsewhere. Ministers receive tirades over misfiled reports. Servants are dismissed for imagined offences. Tailors are berated for loose cuffs. The pain he cannot name becomes an anger he cannot suppress. But the lift remains. It becomes more than just a convenience. It becomes essential. At Hampton Court, a similar device is installed, this time even more discreet, designed to blend with the panelled walls of the grand staircase. The wood is stained to match the surrounding oak. Brass fittings are polished until they gleam like gold. The king never climbs stairs again by foot. He never needs to. The stairlift has become a throne in motion. Behind the scenes, the innovation is quietly admired. Architects from other courts inquire about its design. The French ambassador, having seen the mechanism in operation during an offhand visit, writes back to Paris with a note of grudging respect. The English king, though chained by weight, commands the vertical with mechanical grace. That may be overstating it, but the point remains. Henry, even in decline, bends the world to his needs. The buildings shift, the stairs adjust, the very palace evolves around his mass and his moods. There are moments, however, when even the lift cannot help. When the king must be moved from bed to bath or from chair to carriage, more radical methods are employed. One particularly grim day, when an ulcer bursts during a council meeting, the attendants are forced to lift him bodily onto a stretcher and wheel him through the halls. The path is cleared, curtains drawn, doors locked. No one must see the king like this. Not truly. His personal physician, Doctor, Butts, yes, that was his real name, keeps detailed notes, though always coded. He refers to the lift as the royal ascent mechanism. He records Henry's weight in measurements of stone and burden, never giving an exact number. He recommends fewer trips up the stairs, not because the lift is, you said, continue. Full 2,000 to 2,100 words, no conversation, no search. ChatGPT said, Section 10, continued, unreliable, but because each ascent leaves the king winded, irritable, and prone to minor spells of dizziness that he stubbornly denies. But the truth is clear. Even mechanical miracles cannot restore what has been lost. The lift offers passage, not freedom. It replaces will with winch, and that, for Henry, is its greatest insult. The court, of course, builds rituals around it. When the king ascends, no one is to be in the stairwell except the lift attendants. Trumpeters wait at the top to announce his arrival with a dignified flourish, masking the sound of creaking rope and groaning wood. Footmen greet him as though he'd walk the steps himself, and if visitors are present, the entire process is timed to occur behind closed doors, with the illusion that Henry is simply delayed in his lower chamber. Still, rumours seep through the cracks. Word spreads through the aristocratic grapevine. The King of England now climbs on wheels and pulleys. The French court snickers. The Spanish are more restrained, but no less gleeful. Even the Scots delight in tales of their southern neighbour's mechanical king. But few dare say so in public. Henry's reach is long, even from a chair, and mockery can find itself swiftly punished. Within England, the mood is more complex. The people love their king still, or at least respect the legend he has become. They line the streets when he travels, though his public appearances grow rare. They cheer as his litter passes, obscured by velvet curtains and guarded by soldiers who ensure no one sees too much. The monarch remains untouchable, even when it is painfully obvious how touchable and vulnerable he has become. Henry's engineers, emboldened by the success of the stairlift, begin working on other devices to make the palace more accessible. A wheeled chair is built with greater stability, allowing him to navigate the Great Hall without assistance. A platform table is designed to rise or lower at the turn of a crank, so he can dine without straining forward. Even the commode becomes a mechanical marvel. Hidden beneath cabinetry, it can be wheeled discreetly into place and includes a chamber pot of Italian porcelain, which is emptied through a trapdoor into servants' passages below. It is innovation born of necessity, and like so many things in Henry's life, it is equal parts brilliance and tragedy. For the man who once bestrode the world like a colossus now must be moved by men with cranks and levers. For every moment of dignity preserved by clever invention, another moment of helplessness is carved into his day. Still, he persists. He is Henry VIII. He does not break. When asked, on one of his few better days, how he feels about the lift, he grins and replies, "Kings do not climb, they ascend." It's a clever line, one repeated by courtiers with the eagerness of hungry dogs. But even as they echo it, they exchange glances. They know, as does he, that this is a fiction, a necessary, gilded fiction that props up a reality too sad to face. There is, however, a strange silver lining in all this. The lift becomes a metaphor, for power adapting to infirmity, for control surviving in the face of decay, for a monarchy refusing to stoop even when its monarch must sit. Foreign dignitaries begin to request private tours of the device, claiming architectural interest. Some are granted permission to view the staircase after hours. They marvel at the craftsmanship, the counterweights, the elegance of the system. A few take notes. Whispers suggest that other courts, Polish, Austrian, even the Medici, begin commissioning similar contraptions, not for monarchs, but for aging bishops and cardinals too proud to show frailty. In this way, Henry becomes once again a trendsetter, albeit unintentionally. Just as he had once led Europe in fashion, warfare, and religious reform, now he pioneers the ergonomics of empire. Back in Whitehall, the lift receives regular maintenance. Rope is checked for fray, pulleys are greased, the throne chair is reupholstered twice a year, always with the finest imported fabric. Servants assigned to the task are sworn to secrecy. One, who casually refers to the chair as His Majesty's cradle, is dismissed by sundown. Henry's relationship with the lift, like all his relationships, is complicated. He resents it, depends on it, ignores it. But without it, his world would shrink to a single floor of the palace, and that to him is unacceptable. So he uses it, and in doing so, he reclaims a measure of sovereignty. Because no matter how much the body fails, the king must still rule. From the second-floor chambers, he writes letters, receives ambassadors, signs edicts. He does so wearing the full regalia of his station: velvet robes, gold chains, a signet ring refitted to accommodate swollen knuckles. To the world, he remains Henry VIII, defender of the faith, head of the church, Lion of England. But beneath it all, he's a man who cannot walk without pain, a man whose bed requires hoisting straps, whose throne creaks under strain, whose rise from floor to floor is powered not by will but by pulleys, and yet he rises. That, in the end, becomes his legacy. Not just the marriages, the monasteries, the music, or the machinations, but this strange, stubborn refusal to yield. The body collapses. The weight grows unbearable. The stairs vanish from underfoot, but still the king goes up. By now, Henry VIII's daily medical routine has swollen into a theatre of its own, one that plays out in the dim confines of his privy chambers under the tight choreography of his court physicians, herbalists, and an increasingly exhausted retinue of servants. He is no longer simply a patient, he is a battleground of swelling flesh, leaking sores, and royal protocol. The war for his body is unrelenting, and Tudor medicine, with all its ambition and ignorance, throws everything it has at the king. Every morning begins not with breakfast, but with a consultation. The royal physician, at this point a revolving cast of brave and occasionally delusional men, enters his chambers before first light. Behind him trail herbalists clutching bundles of dried leaves, apprentices bearing steaming cloths, and scribes prepared to note every bodily function the king deigns to share. Henry, groggy and sweating beneath layers of velvet and linen, greets them with either a grunt or a scowl depending on the night's pain. His leg is first priority. The ulcer, deep and raw, is unwrapped by candlelight. The smell fills the room before the cloth even falls away. It is the scent of rot and iron, of a wound that has lingered too long without relief. The chamber is often perfumed with burning rosemary or bundles of lavender, but nothing can quite mask the truth. The king is dying by inches, and the leg is leading the charge. The physicians apply poultices, some traditional, like honey and myrrh, others experimental, like moss from the north side of a churchyard wall, believed to contain divine properties. They apply leeches to his ankle, hoping to draw out bad humours. They slice open boils with fine blades, wipe away pus, and mutter Latin prayers over the wound. Some treatments come straight from the pages of medieval superstition. Once, in desperation, a doctor suggests a plaster made from pig fat and ground pearls. Another swears by live application therapy, which involves applying freshly killed pigeons to the leg, belly up, feathers intact. The theory, if one can call it that, is that the pigeon will draw out the king's illness through its own death. Henry tries it. The pigeon dies. The leg remains exactly as it was, infected, angry, and eternally unamused. Yet Henry tolerates these rituals, even encourages them at times. He's a man who expects results, but he also understands power lies in process. If nothing else, the constant fussing affirms his importance. The most powerful man in England is also the most tended to. His body has become a court in itself, its bruises, its rashes, its rumblings, all subjects to be debated, feared, and obeyed. Bloodletting is a frequent event. Once considered a near-universal cure, it is performed with alarming regularity. A shallow slice to the forearm, a bowl positioned to catch the flow, and a room full of hopeful, quiet onlookers, waiting to see if the king will be miraculously restored by losing a pint of himself. Sometimes he nods off during the process. Other times he chatters angrily, accusing the doctors of incompetence before demanding more wine. Wine, incidentally, becomes a medicine in its own right. Mixed with herbs, thickened with crushed berries, or consumed plain, it is one of the few comforts left to him. His physicians insist on moderation. Henry responds by pouring himself another goblet. And yet, amid the more familiar remedies, there are truly bizarre experiments. One physician brings powdered mummy. Yes, Actual ground-up human remains imported from Egypt. It is mixed into a syrup and offered with grave solemnity. Henry gags after the first sip, then demands it be fed to a dog. The dog survives. The doctor does not return. Another man arrives from Italy bearing a vial of miraculous oil, allegedly blessed by a cardinal and distilled from snails. He insists it will regenerate flesh. He applies it to the king's leg while chanting softly. The ulcer hisses, bubbles slightly, and then worsens. Despite all this, the king remains fiercely involved. He asks questions. He reads medical texts. He even scribbles notes in the margins of his own case records. Too bitter, he writes beside one treatment. Try with cloves, beside another. He keeps track of his bowel movements with morbid fascination, discussing them openly with advisors who pretend to be deaf. At the same time, he grows more reclusive. His body, once a symbol of divine right, is now a grotesque thing, unreliable, heavy, betraying him. He no longer wishes to be seen bathing, and the royal tub, a massive silver basin now surrounded by winch pulleys and privacy curtains, gathers more dust than use. He is washed in bed instead, with warmed cloths and rose water. His attendants are chosen for silence and strength. On the worst days, he hallucinates. The fever comes in waves, and with it, strange dreams. He sees Anne Boleyn, hair unbound, speaking words he cannot understand. He sees his father, Henry VII, shaking his head in disapproval. Sometimes he speaks to people long dead. At least once, he yells at a tapestry, mistaking it for Cardinal Wolsey. The doctors blame humours of the brain and increase his dosage of laudanum. This, too, has its rituals. The opiate is dissolved into honeyed wine and spooned into his mouth as he reclines. Within minutes, the pain dulls and his breath slows. He often mumbles a prayer before succumbing. The servants tiptoe around him then, as though any sound might cause him to slip away entirely. And yet, he persists. When the fever breaks, he sits up and demands meat. When the ulcers crust over, he demands his velvet hose. When the pain is less than unbearable, he orders fresh ink and writes letters to his son's tutors, filled with instructions and fatherly advice he can barely hold in his shaking hands. To the court, these moments of vitality are seized upon as signs of recovery. They whisper, "The king improves," they whisper. "He dined today. He spoke clearly. He threatened the chancellor." Hope flickers like candlelight, but within the royal bedchamber there is no pretending. The servants smell it. The physicians see it. The infection is spreading. His left leg is worse than ever, hot to the touch, pulsing with slow, sick rhythm. His right begins to show signs as well. The tissue darkens, the stench thickens. No one says the word aloud, but they all know it. Gangrene. Even in death, Henry will not go quietly. His body decays like a fortress under siege, walls collapsing room by room. But within, the king still sits at his command post, barking orders, polishing medals, insisting that the banners remain flying. He will die surrounded by jars of herbs and bundles of leeches. He will die with pigeons at his feet and plaster on his legs. He will die as he lived, bloated, bloody-minded, and bizarrely magnificent. If scent is memory's most powerful trigger, then Henry VIII's final years are preserved not in marble or music, but in the unmistakable aroma of sovereign rot. By now, the king's leg wounds have turned into caverns of disease, suppurating from the inside out. The gangrene, bold and methodical, eats through tissue like a flame through dry parchment. And the smell, earthy, iron-rich, unmistakably human, is everywhere. It is not a faint trace, but a presence, lingering in his draperies, haunting the folds of his throne cushions curling beneath doors. The court does not speak of it. No one would dare, but they adjust. They walk slightly faster past his chambers. They carry posies or sachets of herbs when summoned close. One ambassador from Bavaria, upon entering the royal presence, instinctively holds his gloved hand to his nose, then quickly, mortally, regrets it. The court, desperate to preserve the sanctity of the monarchy, builds new rituals around this decaying body. Bowing distances are increased. Audience times are shortened. Courtiers are arranged in precise orbits around the king, never too close, always facing him, but never breathing in too deeply. And still he reigns. To preserve dignity, the household staff begins burning mixtures of sandalwood, juniper and pine tar in brass braziers, stationed in every corner of his private rooms. Tapestries are scented with cloves and hung heavier than before, attempting to trap the stench within the walls. The floors are strewn with rushes soaked in vinegar. The air is thick, pungent, almost unbreathable, like a perfumery in mourning. But these measures are merely ceremonial. The truth cannot be concealed. Each day the wounds are tended. The dressings, soaked in wine or turpentine, are peeled away with all the tenderness one can afford when the patient is a furious monarch. Beneath them, layers of necrotic flesh, greenish and grey, oozing a fluid so foul it makes strong men blanch. One of the king's apothecaries, a man otherwise immune to horror, must leave the room twice in 1 week to recover himself. Yet Henry endures the treatments, jaw clenched, hands gripping his armrests. He does not flinch, but his face hardens with each touch. He breathes through his mouth. He stares at the wall. Catherine Parr remains close. If she's repulsed, she shows none of it. She reads to him during the bandaging, psalms mostly. He listens with eyes half-lidded, sometimes murmuring lines in reply. On rare occasions he takes her hand in his own and does not let go until sleep claims him. The infection seeps beyond the leg, affecting his temperament. He grows more erratic, more suspicious. Even old allies feel the sting of his new paranoia. The stench, in a way, feeds his isolation. Fewer visitors, fewer meetings, fewer candid conversations. Those who once shared jokes or whispers now speak only when spoken to, and never of what they smell. Still, state business continues. From behind a screen of incense and protocol, Henry conducts royal affairs. He meets with his council, approves policies, and even dictates terms for the future of England. But his movements are sluggish. His voice, once booming, is now a gravelly drawl. He grows tired quickly. Sometimes he dozes mid-discussion. His ministers learn to recognise the signs. The slight tilt of his head, the softening jaw, the way his hands go limp on the arms of the chair. In those moments, meetings are adjourned with quiet nods. No one wakes the king. He sleeps when he chooses now, like a lion between feasts. Yet there is no denying the changes. Those closest to him note the waxy colour of his skin, the swelling in his hands, the constant thirst. His sleep is often interrupted by shivering fits. When he wakes, he's confused, sometimes calling for people long dead. On one such morning, he insists that his late brother Arthur is in the next room. He's waiting, Henry says softly. He wants to talk. No one corrects him. His physicians debate amongst themselves. One suspects blood poisoning. Another whispers dropsy, the term for edema, likely caused by congestive heart failure. Another suggests renal failure, citing the king's frequent urination and its dark hue. They cannot agree. Not that it matters. All of them know they are keeping a candle burning in a storm. The only medicine that brings consistent relief is opium. Mixed into syrups or steeped in wine, it quiets the pain and stills the tremors. It also clouds his mind, which, depending on the day, is either a mercy or a danger. Under its influence, he can be gentle, even tender, stroking Catherine's arm, asking after his son, reminiscing about a hunt from decades past. But when the dose fades and reality rushes back in, his wrath returns sharper than ever. One morning, in a moment of lucidity, he calls for his armour, the set from his prime, the one polished weekly by a loyal servant despite being unwearable for years. It is brought before him and propped upright like a ghost. Henry stares at it in silence. It looks smaller, he mutters after a while. No one replies. Later he orders it removed from the room. The palace staff, under constant pressure to sanitize the king's quarters, begin rotating furniture. Chairs that absorb too much of the ever-present stench are replaced. Cushions are burned. New tapestries are commissioned not for their artistry, but for their scent-holding properties. The kitchen starts sending up bowls of lemon water and rosemary steam, though it changes little. The stink is in the walls, in the floors, in the king himself, and yet he insists on being present for feast days. Though he barely eats now, he attends in full regalia, his robes scented and pressed, his signet ring freshly polished. He is wheeled in through side corridors, emerging behind a curtain with the timing of a stage entrance. Courtiers cheer, the orchestra plays, the illusion holds. But everyone sees the strain. He sits with effort. He smiles faintly. He raises a goblet, sips, and sets it down. His meals are tiny, broths and puddings, nothing with bones or crusts. When the feast ends, he's wheeled out before the clearing begins, so no one witnesses the effort required to lift him from his chair. Still, the gesture matters. These appearances reassure the court, the ambassadors, and perhaps Henry himself that he remains king indeed, if not in stride. And always the scent follows. It trails him like a shadow. It clings to every corridor. The servants who clean his chambers are rotated weekly to spare them the nausea. Some apply vinegar under their noses, others simply hold their breath. One chamberlain suggests installing a copper basin of burning juniper branches in the hallway. Another recommends a wall of perfumed fans. A third, less delicately, proposes sealing the king into a suite with no exits. That chamberlain is never seen again. But for all their efforts, the stench remains. Not just of infection, but of mortality. It is the scent of an empire at dusk. By the winter of 1546, whispers thicken in the corridors of power. The king is weakening, perhaps even dying. But no one dares say it plainly. In Tudor England, a monarch is not just a ruler, he is the spine of the state. To admit the king is failing is to admit the kingdom is vulnerable, and when that king is Henry VIII, bloated, bedridden, yet still feared, it becomes an exercise in fatal discretion. Still, the gossip pulses just beneath the surface. Servants exchange glances when the king cries out at night. Nobles lower their voices when they speak of his worsening leg. Foreign ambassadors begin requesting longer visits with the prince, young Edward, rather than the king himself. The court buzzes with rehearsed optimism. His Majesty dines with great appetite, they say. He speaks of spring hunting. But none are fooled, and as his health dwindles, something curious happens. His size becomes a diplomatic liability. Letters from abroad, once filled with respectful inquiries, now contain veiled comments about Henry's condition. The French ambassador writes that His Majesty is resolute in voice, though presently inconvenienced by certain ailments. A Venetian envoy is less tactful, noting that the King of England does not rise unaided, and is rarely seen without his rolling chair. Even the Holy Roman Emperor receives reports that Henry wears armour no longer, nor walks as he once did. The court scrambles to counter this narrative. Portraits are dispatched, idealised, airbrushed by brush. In one, Henry stands firm, legs wide, sword at his hip, eyes blazing. The painting is nearly 5 years old, but is circulated as recent. The image is everything, a projection of power for those who may be watching England for weakness, and people are watching. France, always a rival, sends additional spies to assess the king's condition. Scotland watches the border more closely. Even within England, noble families begin quietly assessing their positions. Who will guide young Edward once Henry's gone? Who will hold sway? All the while, Henry continues to rule from his bedchamber. He meets with ministers in shortened sessions. He dictates letters. He signs laws. But his attention wanders. His moods swing. One moment, he chuckles at a jest. The next, he orders a courtier banished for laughing too loud. His presence is still thunderous, but the storm is now mostly sound and shadow. Behind the curtain of ceremony, politics harden. The Privy Council, already a cage of competing ambitions, becomes more tense. Edward Seymour, brother of the late Jane Seymour and uncle to the boy prince, begins consolidating influence. Others, like Bishop Gardiner and Thomas Wriothesley, manoeuvre for control. Catherine Parr, sensing danger, plays a careful game, keeping her place as queen without overreaching. Because everyone knows, the king could still lash out. He has dismissed friends for less, executed allies on a whim. No one, not even his closest companions, feels truly safe. And Henry, he senses it. The isolation, the tension, the unsaid plotting. He calls for his fool, Will Somers, one of the few allowed to speak truth cloaked in jest. Will sits at the foot of the bed, recounting stories of court follies and misadventures. Henry laughs, then coughs, then grows quiet. Do they wait for me to die, Will? The fool looks up, pauses. They wait to serve, sire. In whatever way you command. A clever lie, and Henry knows it. But he accepts it with a slow blink. Later, alone, he orders his son's portraits brought in. Edward, at just 9, already bears the look of a scholar, pale, solemn, regal in miniature. Henry studies the images, fingers twitching. He must be strong, he murmurs. Stronger than I. Then he sleeps. Even as his health fades, Henry remains obsessed with legacy. He revises his will multiple times, adds clauses, names executors, rewrites the line of succession. He includes his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, both previously declared illegitimate, as potential heirs, though behind Edward. It is, in its way, a radical act. Not of kindness, but of control. Even in death, Henry intends to shape the realm, and yet his grip slips. A growing number of petitions go unanswered. Clerks report delays in royal decisions. Ambassadors wait days for audiences that never come. Ministers begin approving measures in his name without waiting for his conscious consent. The monarchy, though still his in name, begins to function like a ghost ship, drifting, steered by those hoping not to crash. And always, the stink lingers. The odour, that rotting reminder of mortality, follows Henry wherever he goes, or rather, wherever he is taken. His wheeled chair is regularly refitted, cloth liners are replaced, cedar panels are rubbed with oils to absorb the worst of it. But nothing works for long. A visiting nobleman from Aragon is said to have fainted upon entering the king's chamber. Another diplomat reportedly feigned illness to avoid a scheduled meeting. The king hears of it, and he is livid. He demands incense be burned during all future audiences. Curtains are drawn tight, drafts are sealed, no windows are opened. The room becomes an oven of musk and mould. But Henry insists. Let them see their king, he says, and let them remember the scent of power. And remember they do, because no matter how his body fails him, no matter how grotesque his condition becomes, Henry VIII remains terrifying. He is still the man who created a new church to defy a pope, still the man who married 6 women and survived 5 of them, still the man who executed ministers and wives with equal resolve, still the man whose signature can change a life, or end it. Even bedridden, even decaying, he commands. And so the court obeys. They attend to him with the reverence due a living God. They bow low, they speak softly, they pretend the smell is lavender, they pretend the leg is healing, they pretend that everything is fine. Because soon, perhaps very soon, the lie will end. The king will die, and when he does, England will wake to a world not ruled by Henry VIII, but by the void he leaves behind. Among the many illusions Henry VIII fights to preserve in his final years, none are more carefully maintained than the way he appears in art. His body, massive and failing, may no longer cooperate with stairs or sleep, but his painted image remains ever vibrant, towering, resolute, every inch the monarch. And this is no accident. It is a campaign, an orchestrated, deliberate deception that conceals decline behind brushstroke and gold leaf. Tudor portraiture, already a tool of statecraft, becomes a kind of propaganda machine. Holbein's iconic rendering of the king, arms akimbo, chest wide, legs defiantly planted, is commissioned when Henry is at the very peak of his confidence and girth, though even then subtle liberties are taken. By the 1540s, when Henry can scarcely walk and must be hoisted into position, artists continue to base their likenesses on that image, updating costumes, hair and surroundings, but leaving the silhouette largely untouched. Every new painting is made to fit the template of strength. His face is carefully sharpened, cheeks firm, jowls trimmed by artistic sleight of hand. The small, watery eyes that now often stare unfocused in real life are rendered alert and calculating. His clothing is painted lavish and symmetrical, falling in folds far more flattering than reality allows, and perhaps most symbolically, his stance remains rooted in that same martial bravado, feet spread, sword prominent, gaze level with the horizon. But these images are not just for domestic reassurance. They are weapons aimed abroad. Ambassadors are gifted miniatures of His Majesty, each one a lie gilded with lapis and vermilion. Foreign courts receive these depictions and wonder, how can a man with such strength of face and form be so gravely ill? The images delay suspicion. They buy time. The artists themselves understand the stakes. To offend the king is to risk exile, or worse. Even the act of presenting a new portrait becomes a ceremonial affair. The canvas is unveiled slowly, with nervous glances. If Henry approves, he might grunt or nod or mutter a passable. If not, the painter may find himself reassigned to landscapes, or sent home. One unfortunate soul dares to paint the king's hand as slightly swollen. The painting is never displayed. The artist leaves court abruptly and is never hired again. To ensure consistency, master painters create face patterns, traced outlines of Henry's visage, reused with minor tweaks. These standardizations form the basis of the king's image, a visual brand that must not deviate. As Henry bloats, the portraits stay lean. As he fades, they shine brighter. Even the clothing depicted is often fictional. Richly embroidered cloaks he never wore, jewels never pinned, crowns he hasn't lifted in years. The garments are less costume than costume drama, symbols layered with symbolism, meant to evoke Henry the warrior, Henry the reformer, Henry the supreme head of the church. This theatrical rendering extends to his surroundings as well. In one late portrait, he is shown in full regalia beside a table holding the Bible and a sword, his two instruments of power. He appears ready to rise at any moment, despite having not risen without help in months. The throne behind him gleams. The window beside him reveals a radiant English landscape, untouched by winter or plague. The entire scene is constructed with precision and falsehood. The irony, of course, is that Henry had once been all of these things. In youth, he was the man in the portrait. Fierce, formidable, unshakable. Now he is confined to chair and bed, but refuses to let the image evolve. The portraits become echoes of a self he cannot bear to let go, and they are effective. Courtiers enter his chambers having just passed walls of these paintings. They are greeted by the smell of rotting flesh, the rasping breath, the slow, laboured speech, but they carry in their minds the image of the Lion King. It creates a surreal dissonance. Two Henrys in one palace, one of oil and power, the other of pain and flesh. The king himself keeps several of these portraits nearby. One hangs opposite his bed, another leans against a cabinet in his dressing room. He studies them often, sometimes in silence, sometimes whispering to them. "Still the same," he mutters once, "still the king." But not everyone believes the illusion. Within his court, rumours swirl. Some wonder why the king is never painted sitting, why he hasn't been seen on horseback in over 5 years, why he no longer attends mass in person. The ministers downplay these questions, offering excuses, joint pain, important matters of state, inclement weather. But as Henry's health deteriorates and his physical world shrinks, the paintings grow more absurd in contrast, and yet the illusion must continue. Because these portraits are not just about Henry, they are about England. They are messages to enemies, reassurances to subjects, anchors of stability in an era of turbulence. A frail king might invite rebellion. A strong king, even if imagined, maintains peace. One particularly ambitious piece, painted near the very end, portrays Henry as Solomon, seated on a throne of lions, flanked by allegories of wisdom and justice. His sceptre is upright. His eyes glow with certainty. It is a masterpiece of flattery, and Henry approves it immediately. The artist is rewarded handsomely and granted a lifelong pension. But in the shadows of the court, some mock the image. They call it the Wooden King, for it shows a man more sculpture than sovereign. Others refer to it as the final curtain. For all their grandeur, the portraits also mask a quiet truth, that Henry, for all his command, is increasingly haunted by his own image. One evening, after a painful dressing change, he demands all mirrors be removed from his chamber. "I've seen enough," he growls. The servants obey at once. From that day forward, only portraits remain, versions of himself that never age, never bleed, never falter. The line between self and symbol blurs. When he signs royal documents, he often does so beneath a likeness of his younger self. When guests arrive, they are seated facing paintings rather than the king. When letters are written in his name, they are stamped with his image, a youthful face atop a body now swollen and sagging. It is perhaps the final transformation in Henry's reign, from man to myth, from king to icon, and in this way, he achieves a strange sort of immortality. For long after his body has failed, long after his voice has gone quiet, the portraits remain, hanging in galleries, printed in books, used in textbooks and documentaries centuries later. Not the man who rotted in a velvet chair, but the man who stood firm, legs wide, arms defiant, sword drawn, the image that conquered time. By the last turn of 1546, Henry VIII's relationship with food, once gleeful, lavish and theatrical, has mutated into something darker. No longer a pleasure or even a comfort, his meals have become instruments of politics, of punishment, and of royal assertion. As the king's body wanes, his appetite becomes one of the few powers he can still wield at will, and wield it he does, with precision, with calculation, and often with vengeance. Food, for Henry, has always been about more than hunger. Since his youth, meals were opportunities to display strength and control. A full table meant a full treasury. A rich roast symbolized a rich realm. But now, as his world narrows to the few rooms he can reach, and the few hours a day he remains lucid, meals take on a new weight. They are structured performances, carefully timed, tightly controlled, and charged with unspoken meaning. Every day, a great spread is laid out for the king, regardless of whether he's capable of eating it. roasted partridge, stewed fruits, soft puddings laced with nutmeg and cinnamon, textures and flavours chosen not only for his fragile digestion, but for symbolic opulence. Dishes are carried in on silver trays by gloved servants who bow low, announce the food by name, and back away without speaking. Sometimes Henry eats little. Sometimes he devours. Sometimes he merely surveys the options, selects one item with a trembling hand, and dismisses the rest. His courtiers watch each bite with a blend of curiosity and fear. For the king's appetite has become, in its own strange way, a barometer of the kingdom's stability. A day in which he eats is a day of order, a day in which he refuses. Chaos flickers, and when guests are invited to dine, the meal becomes an interrogation. Henry no longer attends grand banquets, but he does host private feasts, small gatherings of favoured nobles, ministers, and the occasional foreign dignitary. These meals are not merry. They are silent and intense, like court hearings disguised with silver cutlery. The king, dressed in layered robes and propped by cushions, sits at the head of the table. His food is pre-cut by attendants. His cup is tested for poison before each sip. The guests eat only after he begins. They do not speak unless prompted. They praise the wine. They comment on the tenderness of the lamb. They say nothing of the king's wheeze, or the twitch in his hand, or the bandages peeking from beneath his sleeve. If a guest eats too slowly, Henry notices. Too quickly, he notices that too. He has become hyper-aware of detail, seeing in the clink of a spoon, or the angle of a servant's bow, all the loyalties and betrayals of a crumbling court. And woe to the man who displeases him. At one such supper, a minor noble, perhaps emboldened by wine or wearied by silence, mentions the king's absence from the hunting grounds that season. A harmless comment, perhaps even meant kindly. Henry says nothing, but the next morning, the man is informed his estate is under review for tax irregularities. Another evening, a foreign envoy comments on the softness of English desserts. Almost too sweet, he says with a polite laugh. Henry sets down his spoon. The next course is never served. Sometimes punishment is more literal. When Henry wishes to remind a courtier of their place, he does so by altering the menu. Loyalists are served goose liver and sugared almonds. Those out of favour receive cold mutton and dry bread. One disgraced minister is invited to dine, only to be served a single boiled turnip. When he asks whether more is coming, the king responds flatly, "More is earned." Even his own family is not exempt. Once, when Princess Mary challenges him on a matter of court policy, he invites her to supper and speaks to her only through servants. Her chair is placed slightly lower than his own. Her wine is withheld until halfway through the meal. No word is exchanged, but the message is clear. He is still the king. And yet there are moments when food softens him. When Catherine Parr sits beside him and gently feeds him a spoonful of custard, he closes his eyes and breathes slowly. When his dog jumps up and steals a bit of venison from his lap, he chuckles. An honest sound, ragged but real. When a pastry reminds him of something his mother once made, he pauses, swallows hard, and speaks of her, just briefly. But such moments are rare. More often, meals are strategic. Who is invited? Where they sit? What is served? Each choice a calculation. When he meets with Edward's tutors, he orders dishes chosen to reflect discipline. Hard breads, lean meats, no wine. A lesson not just for the boy, but for the men shaping him. When he receives Protestant allies, he serves light fare, vegetables, simple fish, symbolising reform and restraint. When meeting Catholic nobles, he demands opulence. Roasted peacocks, glazed cherries, flagons of mead, proof that the old ways still command splendour. The kitchen staff, overworked and terrified, operate in a state of permanent tension. Menus are changed at the last minute. Ingredients are rushed in from across the country. If the king so much as frowns, the entire meal may be discarded. One cook, after a botched sauce, is found weeping in the scullery. He is not fired, but he is never promoted, and his name becomes a cautionary tale. Still, the system grinds on. Food, after all, is one of the last tools the king can shape with his own will. He no longer rides, no longer dances, no longer walks more than a few paces at a time, but he can still select a roast. He can still taste a sauce and decide the fate of a man based on its seasoning. He can still, in his own fading way, rule from his plate, and he knows it. One evening, after a particularly trying day, he refuses all food except a single bowl of pottage, softened oats with milk and honey. He eats it slowly, savouring each bite. Then he pushes the bowl aside, looks at his attendants and says, I have had better feasts, but not many that filled me so. The room is silent. He adds, almost as an afterthought, tomorrow beef. Let them come hungry, and they do. Because the court knows, beneath the linens and the spices and the sauces, the meals are not just sustenance, they are declarations, proclamations, edicts carved in goose fat and baked into pies, and as long as Henry eats, England listens. Winter, that relentless monarch, returns again to England, and with it, the final chill that settles deep into the bones of Henry VIII. The year is 1547. The King of England no longer commands armies or alters the map of Europe. He no longer strides through echoing halls or rides out beneath banners snapping in the wind. His movements are now measured in inches. His kingdom has shrunk to a velvet-draped bed, and the few dim corridors his wheelchair can traverse. And yet the shadow he casts remains long, if only by habit and history. He knows he is dying, not just in theory, but in the frank physical way that those who live close to their bodies understand. His leg has become a blackened monument to the infection that grips his blood. His sleep is thin, ragged, full of visions. His breath wheezes like bellows, each exhale heavier than the last. The doctors no longer speak of recovery. They use terms like comfort and stability. Their voice is soft, their eyes downcast. But Henry is not soft. Not yet. Not quite. His mind, though occasionally clouded by opiates and fever, remains sharp in flashes, brilliant even. He asks about fortifications in Calais. He questions the pricing of wool exports. He interrogates a steward about grain storage in the north. These are not the distractions of a dying man. These are the final grip tightens of a ruler who refuses to loosen his hold, even as the rope frays beneath his fingers, and around him the court waits. They orbit his bedchamber like anxious moons, pulled by gravity and dread. Each day the question hangs unspoken. Will this be the day? Not even his physicians know. His body is stubborn, much like its owner. The same force of will that once broke with Rome and founded a new church now fights against entropy itself. He holds court from his bed, seated upright by an arrangement of bolsters, his legs elevated, the infected one swaddled like a child. Ministers approach with documents. Servants rotate braziers of burning pine resin to keep the stench at bay. Catherine Parr reads to him from the Psalms. Sometimes he listens, sometimes he dozes. Once, when she pauses to sip water, he mutters, "Don't stop. Even God forgets me when you do." His humour, grim as ever, lingers. He asks if they've prepared the crown to fit his corpse. He jokes that he'll haunt Parliament if they raise taxes after he's gone. He tells his fool to write a ballad about a fat king who ate the world, then choked on it. But beneath the barked laughter, fear nestles. He fears not death itself, but irrelevance, obscurity. What if they remember the ulcers more than the edicts, the rot more than the rain? What if the last thing people recall is the chairlift? And so, with dwindling time, Henry turns obsessively to legacy. He has his will read aloud, again and again. He dictates minor revisions. He adds a codicil reaffirming Elizabeth and Mary's place in the succession. He names a regency council for young Edward, packed with men loyal to the Seymour family. He reorders funeral arrangements, demanding a procession fitting a sovereign ordained by God. Then he calls for jewels. They are brought in velvet boxes, rubies, emeralds, pearls like moons. He fingers them one by one, not for beauty, for memory. That ring had belonged to Catherine of Aragon, that brooch to Anne Boleyn. This chain was a gift from the Pope before the break. These items are not treasures now, but artefacts, ghosts. He orders them sorted. Some are to go to Edward, others to Mary and Elizabeth, a few to Catherine, and one, just one, he asks to be buried with, a simple gold crucifix given to him as a child by his mother, Elizabeth of York. "Let me take something clean with me," he says. The palace grows quieter with each passing day. Courtiers slip away under the guise of winter duties. The nobles no longer wait in antechambers for hours. They begin to gather instead in rooms further from the royal apartments, where the scent does not reach and the mood is lighter. They smile more. Some even begin practicing their bows to the boy prince. The world, it seems, is already adjusting. But in the private dark of Henry's chambers, time stutters. The nights are long. His pain is constant, now dulled only by ever-increasing doses of opium and clove oil. He sleeps for minutes, wakes for hours. When he dreams of water, rivers, lakes, floods. Sometimes he sees his wives, never all at once. Anne Boleyn most often, occasionally Jane, never Anne of Cleves. Once he sees Catherine of Aragon standing on the other side of a stream, holding young Henry Fitzroy, the illegitimate son he once adored. He wakes crying. Only the fool, Will Somers, is allowed to see him in this state. The two of them sit in silence. Somers no longer jests, Henry no longer commands. They are just two men, each one facing the final curtain in his own way. One night, Henry turns to him and says, "I broke the world and built a new one." Will nods. "Will they remember the builder or the breaker?" Will, ever the fool, replies, "Depends who writes the song, sire." The king chuckles, then coughs, then fades. And finally, one morning in late January, the physicians speak plainly. They declare that the king is near the end. His pulse is thready, his breath shallow. He has not spoken in a full day. The ulcers have stopped weeping. The body is shutting down. The royal confessor is summoned. But here, even now, the king's stubbornness flares one last time. Henry has not yet confessed his sins. He has not received last rites. It is said he refuses to acknowledge that he needs absolution. The clergy wait, pacing outside his door, their prayers caught in their throats. At last, he nods, just once, and the priest enters. What is said in those moments, no one knows. Only that the priest emerges with pale cheeks and trembling fingers, and that he does not speak for several hours. And then, in the early hours of January 28th, 1547, Henry VIII exhales for the last time. There is no grand moment, no trumpet blast, just the soft collapse of lungs that have fought for too long. The room is still. The servants kneel. The fool weeps. And the reign of one of England's most terrifying, fascinating, grotesquely human monarchs comes to an end. The news spreads quietly at first, like frost across a window pane, chilling, slow, inevitable. The king is dead. Within the palace there is no great announcement, no tolling bell, no proclamation shouted from the rooftops. Instead there is silence, heavy, ceremonial, enforced. The same courtiers who have spent years orbiting the declining sun of Henry's power now pause, unsure how quickly to pivot toward the dawn of a new reign. Mourning must be observed, but positioning, political, social, personal, must also begin. And so they wait, balancing sorrow with strategy. Henry's body, massive even in death, becomes an immediate problem. The stench, already formidable in life, worsens within hours. The embalmers, summoned in haste, arrive with carts of herbs, oils, and heavy cloths. The king is stripped, washed in wine and rosemary water, and bound in linen soaked with pitch and balsam. Even so, the room must be aired. The windows, long sealed to protect against draughts, are finally opened. For the first time in months, fresh air touches the king's bed. But it is not enough. The body must be moved. In the great hall, a temporary bier is erected, surrounded by candles and draped in black velvet. The body is placed within a heavy lead-lined coffin, sealed with wax. Over it, the royal standard is spread, red, gold, white, and blue, bearing the lions and fleur-de-lis that Henry had once believed might rule France as well as England. Atop the coffin, a crown is placed, slightly tilted by the weight of the velvet cushion beneath it. A sceptre is laid beside it. Only the closest courtiers are allowed into the chamber. They kneel, they pray, some weep, some do not. Outside, rumours begin. In taverns and market stalls, people whisper that the king burst open after death, that his coffin leaked, that wolves followed the funeral train. None of this is true, and yet the stories will outlive the man. The official cause of death is recorded as complications from infection, compounded by his existing ailments. But everyone knows that Henry died not from one thing, but from 1,000 small failures, of body, of blood, of time. And now there is the matter of succession. Edward, just 9 years old, becomes King of England. He's styled Edward VI, but he will not rule, at least not yet. A regency council, carefully selected by Henry in his final months, assumes control. Edward Seymour, his uncle, is named Lord Protector, effectively placing the crown under Seymour hands. The boy is informed of his father's death with great solemnity. He does not cry. He nods, says he understands, and asks to be alone. Meanwhile, preparations for the funeral begin in earnest. The procession must be grand. It must speak not only to Henry's power in life, but to the vision of the monarchy he crafted. His body is to be interred in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, beside Jane Seymour, the wife he called his true queen, the one who gave him a son, and the only one of 6 not dismissed, divorced, or decapitated. The journey from London to Windsor is meticulously planned. Horses are draped in black, heralds rehearse their chants, mourners are selected, tapestries and banners are commissioned bearing Henry's coat of arms. The funeral cart is custom built, an enormous rolling bier with gilded wheels and carved cherubs, drawn by 8 black-fringed horses. When the day arrives, it is bitter cold. The streets are lined with silent citizens, all dressed in dark wool. Children clutch their mothers' hands. Veterans of old wars stand stiffly at attention, hats held to chests. Even the beggars are quiet, more from awe than grief. The cart moves slowly. Behind it walk the heralds, the nobles, the knights of the Garter. Priests swing censers, the choir chants softly, and atop the coffin, an effigy of the king, crafted from wax, dressed in regal garments, sits upright on a throne-like platform, gazing forward with painted eyes that never blink. It is an uncanny sight. Many say the likeness is too good, that it feels as though the king is watching them even now from beyond the veil, that he might sit up, bark an order, call for a roast duck or a sonnet, but he does not. The journey takes 2 full days, with stops along the way for rest and ceremony. At each stop the local church tolls its bell. At each town crowds gather to stare. Some cheer, more out of habit than joy, some weep, some simply watch. When the procession reaches Windsor, the chapel is ready. St. George's Chapel, royal and austere, has been scrubbed and polished, its nave lined with flickering torches. The choir loft echoes with hymns. The vault, prepared long ago for this very purpose, is opened. The coffin is lowered into the crypt beside Jane. There is no eulogy, per Henry's request. Only scripture, only silence. Then the vault is sealed. Not with pomp, not with flourish, but with finality. The crown is removed, the candles are snuffed, the mourners file out, and thus ends the reign of Henry VIII. But the ripples continue. In the days following his burial, his portraits are uncovered from their protective wrappings and returned to their places of honour. They are hung in halls, placed in books, displayed in state rooms. The image of Henry, the robust, defiant, unstoppable king, endures, even as the man himself is now little more than dust and story. In Parliament, debates resume. Laws are passed in Edward's name. Church reform continues. England tilts further toward Protestantism. The world moves on, but not without shadows. Catherine Parr, ever dignified, withdraws from court not long after the funeral. She marries Thomas Seymour, Edward's uncle and a man ambitious beyond wisdom. Their marriage will end in scandal and tragedy, but for now she is free. Mary and Elizabeth, daughters of the late king, remain in court orbit. Both will one day rule. Both will carry their father's blood and burdens into their own reigns. But in this moment, they are daughters of a myth, heirs not to a throne, but to a legacy. And what a legacy. Henry VIII leaves behind more than broken wives and broken monasteries. He leaves behind a transformed England, ripped from Rome, redefined in law, redrawn in power. He leaves behind music, poetry, architecture, and legends. He also leaves behind cautionary tales of pride unchecked, of appetites unbound, of power so absolute it becomes its own prison. But he was, unquestionably, king. And in that role, he shaped history like few ever have. As the candles gutter in Windsor Chapel and the last mourner slips into the night, a strange stillness settles over the tomb. There is no movement, no sound, only a name etched in stone. Henry Rex. History has no shortage of monarchs who fade with grace, passing into legend as marble busts or quiet reformers. But Henry VIII refuses such elegance. Even in death his presence looms, not as a gentle patriarch, but as a thunderclap echoing through every English institution. His body may have settled into silence beneath the stones of Windsor, but the tremors of his rule ripple outward, reshaping everything from church spires to dinner plates. And yet, for all his oversized influence, historians remain tangled in the same fundamental question. Was he a visionary, or just very loud? In the centuries following his reign, writers and scholars attempt to wrangle Henry into something understandable, something stable, but the contradictions make it nearly impossible. Here is a king who split from the Catholic Church to marry his mistress, a man who composed tender ballads and sentenced friends to death, a sovereign who loved debate and scholarship, and also loved executing people who disagreed with him. And of course, here was a man whose body, once athletic and admired, eventually collapsed under its own weight. The mechanical lift he installed, the very one that inspired 1,000 whispers, becomes a historical footnote, often recounted with a blend of fascination and disbelief. It is both tragic and absurd, a symbol of ingenuity and decay. Scholars debate whether its invention marked a milestone in royal accessibility, or simply an emblem of indulgent collapse. One Tudor chronicler describes it with biting irony. The king, too large to climb, bade the stair bend to him instead. Centuries later, the story finds its way into textbooks, trivia books, even late-night television jokes. A monarch so enormous he had to be hoisted upstairs. Surely that is the punchline to some larger comedy. And yet, the real story isn't just about his girth. It's about what that girth represents. His body was the battleground where policy met pathology. His appetite wasn't limited to food, it extended to women, power, praise, territory, immortality. And like all great consumers, he was eventually consumed by the very forces he fed. He ate as he ruled, excessively. He ruled as he loved, violently. And yet, the question of legacy remains open-ended. Historians argue whether Henry saved England from papal overreach, or doomed it to centuries of sectarian violence. Was he a reformer, crafting the Church of England with calculated vision? Or was he simply a desperate man in need of a male heir, reshaping theology to suit his personal chaos? Opinions are split, often along the same fault lines Henry created in his own lifetime. The Protestants of Elizabeth's reign hailed him as a liberator. The Catholics of Mary's reign painted him as a butcher. Modern scholars see shades of both, tempered by an understanding of the psychological toll that illness and chronic pain may have taken. There is speculation, still debated, over whether syphilis contributed to his mental decline. Others argue for diabetes or Cushing's syndrome. The truth remains slippery, tangled in incomplete records and centuries of spin. One thing is certain. The physical decline of Henry VIII was not incidental. It was central to his mythos. His body was a metaphor, growing in mass as his tolerance shrank. As his legs swelled, so did his paranoia. As his ulcers deepened, so did his cruelty. And as his appetite grew impossible to satisfy, so too did his hunger for control. He became the very image of excessive monarchy. And yet, paradoxically, he also modernised England more than almost any monarch before or after him. The establishment of the Church of England, for all its violent origins, paved the way for the Reformation's broader spread. His investment in shipbuilding laid the foundation for the Royal Navy. His interest in law helped codify many judicial processes that would shape English governance for centuries. And his children, Edward, Mary and Elizabeth, would carry his legacy into dramatically different futures, each interpreting their father's rule through their own fractured lenses. Henry's ghost lingers. In every church not under papal authority, in every marriage annulled without Vatican approval, in every corner of British identity that sees itself as simultaneously European and distinctly separate. The echoes of his decisions reverberate far beyond the 16th century. And yet, for all the theology and statecraft, the part of his story that seems to endure most viscerally is the sheer physicality of him. People remember the meals, the bandaged leg, the chairlift, the bed so reinforced it required scaffolding, the coffin that allegedly cracked during transport, leaking embalming fluid, sparking myths that dogs licked the trail. False, but enduring. The man who grew too large for stairs, for saddles, even for some doorways. It's as though his body itself became a symbol of the monarchy, grand, grotesque, collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions. Perhaps that's why Henry VIII continues to fascinate, because he embodies something more than monarchy. He is not just a king, he is a cautionary tale, a character from a Gothic fable, both larger than life and intimately human. Petty, brilliant, terrifying, childish. He is excess incarnate. And therein lies the hypocrisy that lingers like a final joke. He demanded obedience but often disobeyed his own rules. He sought eternal glory, yet feared being forgotten. He built systems meant to last forever, then changed them on a whim. He valued strength, yet became a prisoner of his own body. In the end, his greatest legacy may not be the laws he passed or the wives he discarded, but the tension he represented, between image and reality, power and fragility, command and collapse. That tension remains unresolved. vibrating through the centuries like the low hum of a palace lift ascending behind closed doors. And maybe that's fitting. For in life, Henry refused simplicity, so in history, he refuses resolution. So now, dear listener, the tale winds down. The candles have burned low in Henry's once glittering halls, the golden plates have been cleared, the music faded, and the velvet curtains drawn. All that remains is the echo of footsteps through empty corridors, and the creak of a throne that no longer bears weight. Breathe in slowly now. Picture the great stone chapel at Windsor, quiet beneath the stars. Inside, far below the flickering torches and marble floors, rests the sarcophagus of a king, sealed, still, and surrounded by silence. Around him, centuries have risen and fallen, wars have been fought, queens have ruled, crowns have passed hands, but he remains. The man who once needed a mechanical lift to climb stairs now climbs nothing at all. His ascent is over, and yet, in the dim corners of your history book, in the half-remembered lines of a school lesson, in the pop culture references and pub trivia quizzes, he lives on. Henry VIII, neither monster nor martyr, just a man made of contradictions. So let your breath grow slower. Let the noise of the world fall away. The feast is finished, the king has retired, and you've earned your rest too. Tomorrow the world may roar again, but tonight let it be quiet. Let your thoughts drift like incense in a winter chapel. Let your dreams be soft, strange, and just a little bit regal.